The morning sun cast long golden streaks across the quiet rest stop just off I-94, where maple trees swayed lazily in the breeze and the smell of brewed coffee lingered from a nearby vending station. Parked neatly between two empty spots sat a sleek black Tesla Windows, clear engine softly humming its occupant still and composed. Inside sat Judge Theodore Langston, 62, dignified in a tailored navy suit, his graying beard neatly trimmed and his leather briefcase balanced on his lap. He tapped thoughtfully on his tablet, reviewing case notes for an upcoming judicial ethics roundtable with the governor. The silence in his car was peaceful, but not unfamiliar. After decades on the bench, Langston had learned to find stillness in moments of transition. Yet beneath the calm, there was a faint tension, one he had carried his whole life. A black man in a luxury car alone still had to calculate his every move, every stop, every glance. He was aware of it, like a dull ache in the background. And then the ache sharpened. A Michigan State Police cruiser slowed as it passed. Langston noticed in his peripheral vision a slight hesitation, a glance the faint squeal of brakes. He looked up from his screen. The officer didn't continue past the rest stop. Instead, the cruiser reversed slowly, tires crunching against gravel, and stopped a few yards behind his Tesla. A familiar script began to write itself in Langston's mind, one he had heard played out in courtroom testimony again and again. I was just sitting there. Then the lights came on. Officer Garrett Sloan stepped out of the cruiser, with an assertive gate hand already brushing against the grip of his holstered pistol. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the sky, but his posture radiated suspicion. He didn't announce himself, didn't offer a greeting. He simply stared at the car lips' tight expression, unreadable. Langston sighed softly, set his tablet aside, and rolled down the window. He placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel, the universal gesture of survival. "Good morning, officer. Is everything all right?" he asked, tone calm but clear. Sloan didn't answer right away. He scanned Langston from head to toe, clean-cut, professional, deliberate, and frowned as if trying to decode a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. Finally he spoke. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description leaving a gas station nearby. I need you to step out of the car." There was no stolen vehicle. Langston knew it. And Sloan knew it too. His voice lacked urgency, his words robotic like a shield for an action he had already decided to take. Langston blinked slowly, not in fear but in measured disbelief. "I'm not aware of any such report," he said evenly. "I've just stopped for a few minutes to review notes before heading into Lansing. If you'd like, I can show you my registration and ID." But Sloan took a step back and unsnapped the holster strap. "Step out. Now." His voice dropped the pretense no longer investigative, but commanding. Langston paused, heart beating with the rhythm of 1,000 memories his father pulled over at gunpoint in 1973, his nephew searched on the sidewalk in front of his own house, young black men in his courtroom, broken not by guilt but by the weight of assumption. Now here he was, a chief judge reduced in a heartbeat to suspicion made flesh. He opened the door slowly and rose to his full 6'2" frame. Sloan's stance stiffened slightly, hand still near his weapon. Langston said nothing. He refused to argue on the side of a highway, like a man begging for dignity. Instead he stood still, back straight. Breathing steady, his resistance was in his restraint. A second cruiser arrived. Officer Renee Maddox, younger and quieter, stepped out and stood by Sloan without a word. Her eyes flickered uneasily between Langston and her partner, but she offered no question, no pause. Sloan barked, "Hands behind your back." Langston's expression barely changed. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of." "You're interfering with an investigation," Sloan snapped, reaching for Langston's wrist. "What investigation?" he asked, voice low, sharp. "You haven't run my license. You haven't even checked my name." That was all it took. Sloan grabbed him, twisted his arm with practiced aggression, and forced on the handcuffs. Maddox moved in, silently securing the other wrist. A few bystanders watched from a distance, one recording with their phone, another shaking their head in disbelief. Langston didn't resist. But his silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Behind his stillness was a storm gathering. A line had been crossed. And as the metal cuffs bit into his skin, he didn't look at Sloan. He looked past him toward the courtroom, the governor's table, the cameras not yet rolling, because this was far from over. The midday sun burned brighter now, casting harsh reflections off the hood of the black Tesla, as Judge Theodore Langston stood quietly at the rear of his vehicle, wrist shackled behind his back like a common criminal. His shoulders remained square, his posture unbroken, but inside something trembled, not from fear but from fury wrapped in restraint. His mind reeled with every protocol he knew by heart, every constitutional right being trampled in real time. He had presided over hundreds of cases, heard testimonies from men who had stood exactly where he now stood, shamed, profiled, violated. He had always believed he understood. But this was different. This was him. The law wasn't abstract anymore. It was pressing into his skin in the form of cold, unearned steel. Officer Garrett Sloan paced a few feet away, smug and alert, calling in what he described over the radio as a non-compliant suspect. Langston turned his head slightly, catching those words in the air like poison. He had complied, fully, willingly, respectfully, and yet here he was categorized, downgraded, reduced to a code on a radio frequency. Officer Renee Maddox hovered nearby, her eyes shifting with unease. She hadn't said a word since placing the second cuff. Her silence screamed complicity, and Langston felt its weight. She looked young, maybe early 30s, and the discomfort in her expression flickered like a cracked light bulb. But she didn't speak, didn't question, didn't move, and silence in moments like this was as loud as violence. Langston's voice finally cut through the stagnant air, calm, low, but loaded. "I would like to know again what I'm being accused of." Sloan didn't answer. Instead, he walked back toward the Tesla, glancing at the onlookers gathering near the vending machines. A college student in a hoodie was filming from across the lot. A woman with a child stared in confused horror. Still, Sloan marched forward as if performing for no one. He reached the driver's side, opened the door without permission, and leaned inside, rummaging through the glove compartment with loud, clumsy hands. Langston took a small step forward, voice steady as stone. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." Sloan shot upright, slamming the door. "That's obstruction," he barked, eyes wild with manufactured outrage. "You're interfering with an active investigation." "What investigation?" Langston repeated louder, now firmer. "You haven't even asked for my ID. You've made no attempt to verify anything I've said." Sloan stormed toward him, fury now masquerading as authority. "You don't get to play lawyer out here," he snarled. "You don't get to dictate what I do." Langston didn't flinch, not because he wasn't shaken, but because he refused to give Sloan the reaction. He was hunting for the escalation. He wanted to justify this abuse. His restraint was more than control. It was his shield. It was the only weapon he had left. "I'm not playing anything," he replied. "I'm telling you that I know the law, and I know this isn't it." Sloan stepped closer, nose nearly inches away, trying to crowd him, intimidate him. Langston met his gaze head-on, his breath calm, his eyes sharp. This wasn't a battle of noise. This was a battle of presence. Behind them, the college student's phone camera continued rolling. The tension had thickened now, no longer quiet suspicion, but boiling hostility unjustified and exposed. Langston's wrists ached in the cuffs. His back was stiff from standing, but he refused to bend. His resistance was not rage, it was refusal. Refusal to be dehumanized. Refusal to shrink. Refusal to be another anonymous statistic who never got the chance to speak. Sloan walked away briefly, speaking into his shoulder radio. Langston heard the code words, backup non-compliant, possible resistance. It was all performance built on a lie, and he knew how those lies took root in official reports, how they shaped narratives that buried truth beneath red tape and bureaucracy. A soft voice suddenly broke the haze. "Are we sure about this?" Maddox asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Sloan glared back. "We've got protocol to follow. You saw the way he acted." Langston heard it, the echo of a justification born from bias. She had seen the way he acted with patience, with dignity, with obedience. But none of that mattered. He didn't match the narrative in Sloan's head, so Sloan built a new one. Langston turned to Maddox, locking eyes with her. "You still have time to do the right thing," he said, not as a threat, but as a truth. "The badge doesn't protect you from accountability." She looked away. He stood there cuffed, violated, but not broken. Not even close. Inside he was cataloging everything, every word, every misstep, every breach of protocol. The wheels of justice had not stopped turning. They were just turning slower, quieter. But they were turning. And when they did, Langston knew this confrontation would become history. The chains of injustice didn't always rattle. Sometimes they clicked shut with quiet certainty, like the final note of a verdict already written. Judge Theodore Langston stood at the edge of the parking lot, hands cuffed behind him, as if the law itself had turned its back on him. Officer Garrett Sloan stayed close, shoulders puffed, scanning the surroundings like he'd subdued a threat rather than humiliated a man. Officer Renee Maddox stood just behind her, silence clinging to the scene like morning fog, present lingering, impossible to ignore. Langston's heart thudded, not from panic, but from profound disbelief. He had spent a lifetime defending the rule of law. Now shackled by its twisted application, he wondered how many more men had stood in his place, erased in the margins of police reports and tagged with accusations that didn't match the truth, but matched their skin. People were watching now. A small crowd had formed near the coffee vending machine, their expressions ranging from stunned confusion to quiet dread. Among them, a young black college student gripped her phone tightly, the red recording light flashing as she whispered to her friend, "He didn't do anything. He's just standing there." An older white man, gray beard and worn Army vet jacket, crossed his arms and muttered, "That man doesn't look like someone who stole a damn thing." But their voices floated on the wind, powerless to stop what had already happened. Langston's eyes were calm, but far from still. He wasn't thinking of escape or argument. He was calculating. Every gesture, every word exchanged, every unlawful action taken, he was engraving it in his memory like testimony on the record. His inner turmoil was not the panic of the innocent, but the exhaustion of the overproven. He had done everything right, complied, spoken respectfully, offered documentation. But for Sloan, none of it mattered. To him, Langston was just another black man in a nice car, automatically suspicious, automatically wrong. As Sloan opened the back door of the cruiser, Langston hesitated. It wasn't resistance. It was reflection. This wasn't the first time someone in a uniform had decided that power gave them permission. It wasn't the first time a man's life was defined by a glance, a gut feeling soaked in bias. But this time the man was him, and this time he would not disappear into the system. He was the system. Sloan shoved him forward without a word. Langston caught himself against the roof of the car, ducked down and slid into the back seat, the same seat that had held so many defendants whose cases had landed in his courtroom. The door slammed shut. And for the first time in his long legal career, he was the one behind the glass, watching the world shrink through the barred lens of injustice. Inside the precinct just outside Battle Creek, the atmosphere was sterile, indifferent. Langston was led through side doors, not with violence, but with dismissive routine, as if this were just another box to check another body in the system. The booking officer barely glanced up, typing his name as if it meant nothing. Langston Theodore. Black male. Age 62. Reason, suspicion, obstruction. No one noticed the title listed on his driver's license. No one paused long enough to ask why a man in a custom suit, with credentials thicker than their entire personnel files, was being held without explanation. He sat in a hard plastic chair, the red marks from the cuffs still burning against his skin. 3 times he asked calm, direct, respectful to make a phone call, to notify his office, to alert someone he had a scheduled meeting with the governor's judicial advisory panel in Lansing. 3 times he was ignored or waved off. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't resisting, and somehow that made him even more suspicious, as if composure itself was a trick, as if dignity was a disguise. From across the room, officers watched him with narrowed eyes. One muttered, "He looks too calm. Probably hiding something." Another smirked. "Yeah, thinks he's special." Langston heard every word, but he didn't blink. Not because it didn't hurt because it did deeply, but because he refused to give them the satisfaction. He would not raise his voice. He would not demand to be treated like a man. He was a man, a judge, a symbol of justice, and if they couldn't see it, that would be their shame to carry, not his. In that moment, as he sat among careless officers and false assumptions, Langston's resistance took root not in rage, but in stillness. A stillness that spoke louder than any defense, a stillness that whispered, "You will not bury me in this lie." A stillness that began to pull the cracks apart one by one until the entire facade of righteousness would come crashing down, and when it did, the system that tried to erase him would finally be forced to answer for what it had become. The fluorescent lights in the precinct flickered, with a sterile hum casting a cold clinical glow on walls. the color of faded ash. Judge Theodore Langston sat in a hard plastic chair along the holding bench. His wrists now free, but the red marks told the story the officers refused to see. They were the outline of a verdict rendered not in a courtroom, but on the side of a highway by a badge, a bias and a lie. Around him the station buzzed with casual indifference, keyboards clicked, radios, crackled doors opened and shut with rhythm, but no awareness. To them, he was just another black man pulled in under suspicion, another form to process, another body in a system that didn't care who he really was. He had asked 3 times once to the booking officer, twice to Officer Renee Maddox to make a phone call. Not to a lawyer, to his own office. There's a judicial ethics roundtable at the Capitol, he explained clearly. They're expecting me. But each time his request was met with a dismissive shrug or vague delay. One officer even laughed. "You got a lunch date with the governor, too." Langston didn't respond. He was done explaining himself. The law was supposed to protect dignity. But here in this room, dignity wasn't just absent, it was offensive to them. If you're watching this and finding it really interesting, but happen to be busy with something else right now, feel free to subscribe to our channel. That way, this video will be easier to find later, so you can come back and continue the story when you have more time. Across the room, Officer Garrett Sloan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw clenched in quiet pride. He watched Langston like a man waiting for a fuse to burn out, ready for the explosion he thought would come. But it didn't. Langston sat still, posture straight, not in defiance, but in discipline. He knew exactly what was happening. He had ruled on cases just like this. He had heard testimonies from men who were mocked, delayed, ignored, whose calmness was twisted into suspicion, and whose fear was never believed. What he never admitted to those men, even as he gave them justice, was that deep down he had always wondered if he would one day be one of them, and now he was. He scanned the room. None of them had noticed the suede, the polished shoes, the soft leather briefcase they hadn't bothered to search. They saw his skin, his silence, and they made their judgment. One officer glanced his way and said to another, loud enough for him to hear, "He's sitting too quiet, probably thinking up some lawsuit." The other chuckled. "Let him. He won't win." Langston didn't flinch. He'd already won because he hadn't cracked. Not when they cuffed him. Not when they ignored him. Not when they treated his constitutional rights like clutter. Maddox passed through again, and for a moment their eyes met. Her gaze held something, guilt maybe, or recognition. But it flickered and vanished as quickly as it appeared. She said nothing. Langston didn't need her words. He needed her courage, and she didn't have it. Not today. The room shifted when Sergeant Camille Mercer walked in. She was in her early 50s, eyes sharp beneath a neat bun, her uniform pressed with military precision. She carried an air of command not through volume, but through clarity. She stopped at the intake desk, flipping through the log sheet. "How long's this one been sitting here?" she asked, nodding toward Langston. "Nearly 2 hours." "Obstruction," someone replied. Mercer frowned. "He have ID?" They nodded. "Did anyone run it?" A shrug. "We've been swamped." Something in her tightened. She walked over to the nearest terminal and typed his name, Theodore L. Langston. It took 3 seconds, and then the screen changed. Judicial records, court history, academic credentials, awards, appointments, a headshot in formal robes, the search result that shattered the illusion. Her face stilled. Slowly she turned and looked through the glass at the man sitting alone, waiting not for freedom, but for truth to catch up. She moved quickly, the taps of her boots echoing through the floor, like judgment descending. Sloan barely glanced up as she entered the holding area. Maddox stood off to the side, pale now, lips tight. Mercer stopped in front of Langston, her voice even, but marked with something deeper accountability. "Sir," she said. "You said you had a meeting in Lansing." Langston looked up, eyes level. "Yes, with the governor's judicial panel." "Noon." Her voice dropped. "And you are Judge Theodore Langston." He nodded once. Behind her, Sloan straightened. "Wait, what do you mean?" Judge Mercer didn't turn. "You arrested a sitting state judge without probable cause. You denied him his right to contact counsel. You searched his vehicle without a warrant." Her words fell like stones in the room. Maddox looked down. Sloan opened his mouth, but no excuse came. Langston rose slowly, the weight of injustice still on his back, but the tide finally beginning to shift. It wasn't over. but it had begun. The system had looked away long enough. Now it would have no choice but to see. The precinct buzzed like any other weekday afternoon officers, passed through corridors with coffee cups and casual chatter screens, flickered with open reports, and the hum of printers echoed from every corner. But in the center of it all, Judge Theodore Langston sat in silence, the eye of a storm no one yet knew was forming. The hard plastic chair beneath him groaned with each shift of his weight, but he didn't move much. His suit, still crisp, had begun to crease from hours of tension, his cuffs now off, but his dignity bruised. 2 hours had passed since his unlawful arrest, and still no call, no recognition, no apology. Just muttered comments and sidelong glances. To them he was a man out of place, suspicious in stillness, guilty in calm. The badge had made the assumption, and the uniform protected it. Then came Sergeant Camille Mercer. She stepped into the intake area with the quiet force of a woman who commanded authority without raising her voice. Tall, disciplined early 50s with gray streaks in her otherwise dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mercer didn't saunter like the others, she moved with purpose. She paused near the front desk and flipped through the holding logs. Her gaze narrowed when she landed on one entry. Langston Theodore, L., black male, age 62, obstruction suspected vehicle match. She frowned. "Who processed Langston?" she asked, tone crisp. Booking started with Officer Sloan, someone mumbled from behind a terminal. "Didn't finish yet. Been kind of slow." "Has his ID been verified?" Mercer asked. A shrug. He gave it. But Sloan said he was being difficult, so... Mercer's stare hardened. "You got his ID in hand and no one ran it." The air around her changed. She didn't wait for another excuse. She crossed the floor to the nearest workstation and typed the name in herself. The screen loaded in under 5 seconds. Mercer expected a license profile, maybe a clean background, but what appeared instead made her freeze mid-breath. Theodore L. Langston, Presiding Judge 12th, Judicial Circuit, State of Michigan. Harvard Law, former federal clerk. Appellate appointments. Civil Rights Oversight Board. Judicial Reform Leadership. Dozens of published legal opinions. Numerous awards for service. She clicked his official photo. It was him. The same man now sitting 3 rooms away, waiting like a prisoner in the very system he served. Her pulse quickened, not from surprise, but from fury. Fury that no one had bothered to look. Fury that bias had moved faster than facts. Fury that a man whose signature shaped the law in this state had been treated like a threat simply for sitting in his own car. She rose from the chair, her boots hitting the tile with sharp intent as she made her way down the hallway toward the holding room. As she passed, officers looked up from their desks. They could read her face. Something had changed. Something was coming. Inside the holding area, Sloan leaned smugly against the wall, chatting with another officer, still basking in the authority he had so confidently abused. Maddox lingered to the side, arms crossed, staring down at the floor like it might absolve her silence. Mercer pushed the door open. "Sloan," she said coldly. He straightened. "Ma'am." "You arrested a sitting judge?" She said, her voice even but razor sharp. "You cuffed him, searched his vehicle without consent, denied him access to counsel, and you didn't even run his identification. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sloan's face paled. He didn't say he was a judge. He didn't act like Mercer cut him off. "You had his ID. That was your job. And you failed." She turned to Maddox. "And you helped him do it." Langston looked up as she turned to him. She studied his face, still calm, still composed, but the weight behind his eyes had shifted. The silence that had once been helpless had become dangerous, strategic, prepared. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I'm deeply sorry. This should never have happened. Would you like to contact the governor's office now, or would you prefer we arrange a direct escort to Lansing Langston?" Gave a small nod, his voice low but measured. "Yes. That would be appreciated." His eyes never left Sloan, who now stood frozen in the corner, stripped of certainty, stripped of control. Mercer nodded and gestured toward the hallway. The door opened. The man they had cuffed, searched, and dismissed as a nobody now walked freely through the precinct, not with arrogance, but with an air that could not be denied any longer. Officers turned as he passed, confusion and quiet shame on their faces. The truth had arrived, and it had a name they would never forget. The atmosphere in the precinct had shifted, though many didn't yet realize it. The usual buzz, the banter, the radio. Dispatches the casual shuffle of uniformed movement still echoed off the tile and metal. But beneath it, tension stirred quiet and corrosive. Something was unraveling. At its center stood Judge Theodore Langston, once dismissed as just another suspect, now standing tall beside Sergeant Camille Mercer, who had returned to the holding area like a thundercloud ready to split open the truth. Her eyes had already pierced through the haze of arrogance and assumption, but the others were still living in the before they knew who he really was, before the lie cracked. The moment broke wide open with one word. "Your Honor." The silence was immediate. Sloan blinked, his weight shifting like the floor had dropped an inch beneath him. Maddox froze mid-step. The smirk that had lingered on Sloan's face since the roadside encounter vanished, replaced by the fragile expression of a man who'd realized he hadn't just made a mistake. He had detonated a career-ending scandal. Langston didn't respond right away. His face remained composed, but the flicker in his eyes revealed the moment wasn't lost on him. After 2 hours of being treated like a criminal, cuffed, searched, ignored, and silenced, he was finally being acknowledged for who he truly was. Not a threat, not a suspect, but a sitting judge of the 12th Judicial Circuit, a man whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands. Yet what should have been vindication felt like something colder. Confirmation of what he already knew, that dignity in black skin was always conditional, always contingent, always one verification away from being believed. Sergeant Mercer turned to Sloan. Her tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You arrested a state judge without probable cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant. You denied him his right to contact legal representation. You ignored every part of protocol you were trained to follow." Sloan opened his mouth, desperate to cling to authority. "He didn't identify himself. He gave you his ID." Mercer snapped, her voice rising just enough to cut through the room like a gavel. "It had his title on it. Your job was to check it. Instead, you escalated." The shame on Sloan's face deepened into a muted panic. He turned toward Maddox, searching for backup, but she was already shrinking into the background. Her jaw tightened. She couldn't meet his eyes. Langston finally spoke, his voice calm but razor-edged. "You saw a man who didn't look like he belonged behind the wheel of a luxury car parked alone at a rest stop. You didn't see a judge. You saw a profile. He let the words hang there. And you decided that was enough." No one in the room dared speak. The officers at their desks had gone silent, pretending to look busy, but everyone was listening. Langston's voice didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. The restraint in his tone measured unwavering. Haunted with experience carried more power than any outburst. Sergeant Mercer stepped back beside him. "Sir, if you're ready, we'll escort you now. The governor's staff has been informed. They're expecting you." Langston nodded once, turning without another glance at Sloan. As he walked, the precinct parted. Officers who had snickered when he entered now stood still, their eyes avoiding his gaze. Even those who hadn't seen the arrest now felt the tremor in the air. He didn't walk like a man who had been let go. He walked like a man who had decided to expose the system from within. Cameras caught them as they exited Langston in his suit briefcase in hand, escorted not by guards, but by accountability. Mercer beside him, phone pressed to her ear, coordinating logistics with the Capitol. Outside, the world was already catching up. The viral video, 30 seconds of footage showing a judge in cuffs asking calmly, "What have I done wrong?" was spreading across TikTok, Twitter, and every headline that hadn't yet dared to imagine how deep the rot went. Langston paused at the top of the steps outside the precinct, the wind catching the corner of his coat. He took a breath. Not of relief, but of recommitment. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was the story of every black man who had been silenced without cause, and of a system that needed to be forced on camera to tell the truth. The reveal had happened, but the reckoning was only beginning. The footage was only 28 seconds long. No special effects, no commentary, no music. Just raw, uncut reality. A black man in a suit, hands cuffed behind his back, standing silently beside a black Tesla at a rest stop. A white officer rummaging through the car without a warrant. The man's voice calm and low-cut through the audio, "I have done nothing wrong. I do not consent to this search." It wasn't a confrontation, it was a confession of a system on tape. And by the time the sun began to set over Michigan that day, the video was already racing across TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook like a lightning bolt aimed straight at the heart of American conscience. The caption read simply, "Arrested for being black in a suit." Judge Langston. It was posted by a college student, Aaliyah James, who had filmed the incident from across the lot while sipping coffee in her car. Her voice heard faintly in the background of the video cracked with disbelief. He didn't do anything. This is insane. Within an hour, the clip hit 100,000 views. By nightfall, it had crossed over 2 million. Hashtags surged. March Justice for Langston. Truer black and broad. Daylight. Juror judged by color. National outrage ignited not because this was the first time, but because this time the victim wasn't voiceless. He was a judge. And people could no longer pretend the system was blind. News outlets moved fast. CNN replayed the video every hour, their chyron reading, "State judge detained. Without cause, civil rights groups demand action." MSNBC aired a panel of legal scholars and former prosecutors, many of them visibly shaken, dissecting the clear violations of constitutional rights. Fox News tried to spin it as a procedural miscommunication, but even their guests hesitated. A storm was coming, and it didn't care about spin. In the halls of power alarms rang louder. The governor of Michigan's office issued a statement by midnight confirming Judge Theodore Langston had been scheduled to attend a justice reform roundtable, the day of the arrest adding tersely, "This matter is under urgent review. We remain committed to fairness, dignity, and equal treatment under the law." Behind-the-scenes calls were made. District attorneys, civil rights attorneys, elected officials. They all knew what the public would soon demand, not just apologies, accountability. Outside the precinct where Langston had been detained, protesters gathered before dawn. Some held handmade signs that read, "Dignity in cuffs, black bench white bias." "He is the system you swore to uphold." Their chants were not loud at first. They were steady, intentional. "Say his name, Judge Langston." News crews arrived, and with them the nation's gaze. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from the street, but from within. Inside the very station that had held him, the video played on every desktop passed between officers like a mirror some couldn't bear to face. The jokes had stopped. The laughter vanished. Officer Maddox didn't speak. Her eyes were hollow, her silence now heavy with regret. Officer Sloan, once confident, was now sweating under the fluorescent lights of internal review. Word spread quickly an emergency meeting was being convened. The state attorney general's office was involved. A misconduct hearing was imminent. The uniform no longer shielded them. The lie had been filmed. Meanwhile, Judge Langston sat alone in a quiet room within the Capitol building, preparing for the roundtable he'd nearly missed. He had said little to the press, refusing interviews, ignoring the request flooding his phone. But within him a storm still raged, not of vengeance, but of purpose. The humiliation had been public, yes, but so was the truth. And that truth now had reach. It had weight. It had a face. His face. He reflected not on the handcuffs or the search, or even the cold silence of the holding cell, but on how close he had come to being erased. Had he not been a judge, had the student not filmed, had Mercer not checked the system? How many times had this exact scenario played out in darkness? How many others sat in jails right now, nameless, voiceless, buried beneath assumptions and unchecked power? Langston knew this moment wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about every man pulled over for fitting a description. Every woman told she was hostile for asserting her rights. Every teenager cuffed for standing still. This moment was about turning visibility into justice. By the next morning, newspapers from coast to coast ran the same headline in one form or another: "Judge handcuffed without cause, system on trial." And somewhere in the rustle of newsprint, in the fury of retweets and national debates, the echo of Langston's quiet resistance was finally heard, not as a whisper, but as a reckoning. By the time Judge Theodore Langston stepped through the grand marble doors of the Michigan State Capitol the next morning, the world outside had already shifted. His name was etched across headlines and chyrons, his still image in handcuffs plastered across timelines, and his silence, calm, composed, undeniable, had pierced the nation like a verdict against its own conscience. But inside Langston the weight hadn't lifted. It had merely refocused. He wasn't walking into that chamber to reclaim his dignity. It had never truly left him. He was walking in to confront a machine that had tried to strip it away. And this time he wasn't coming as a victim. He was coming as a reckoning. The roundtable, originally scheduled as a policy meeting on court efficiency and budget reform, now pulsed with electricity. What had been a bureaucratic checklist had become a high-stakes forum for systemic accountability. As Langston entered the room, rose not because protocol required it, but because the moral ground had shifted. Every figure in that chamber, from state legislators to police commissioners, attorneys general, to judicial peers, stood not for his title but for the raw truth that had just unraveled in full view of the public. The governor seated at the center leaned forward with solemn gravity. "Judge Langston, we're honored to have you here," he said. Langston offered a nod, eyes level. "The timing, Governor," he replied, "speaks for itself." Before the agenda could begin, Langston raised his hand slightly. "With your permission, I'd like to say something first." A hush fell. "Yesterday morning," he began, his voice low but resonant, "I was stopped without cause, handcuffed without evidence, searched without consent, and detained without dignity. I was on my way to this very meeting representing a state committed at least on paper to justice. And yet for 2 hours I wasn't a judge. I wasn't even a man. I was a silhouette, a suspicion, a risk behind tinted glass." His voice never trembled, but the weight behind every word tightened the air. He paused, scanning the faces across the room. Some nodded solemnly. Others looked down. "This is not just about me," he continued. "This is about the thousands of black men and women who don't get to walk into a room like this and be heard, whose truth is not filmed, whose names do not trend. Trust cannot exist where dignity is conditional, and law without accountability is just performance." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged. Within minutes, the room pivoted. The policy documents were pushed aside. The microphones turned on. What had been a scheduled meeting became a live emergency session. Civil rights advocates were patched in, legal advisors were summoned, and by noon the state attorney general had formally called for a judicial oversight review of the entire arrest. Then came the moment no one had anticipated. A proposal was drafted to initiate misconduct proceedings against officers Garrett Sloan and Renee Maddox. And in a bold, unprecedented move after legal clearance from the governor's council, the room unanimously voted to appoint Judge Theodore Langston himself to preside over the emergency review as a neutral arbiter. Langston hesitated. "I do not seek vengeance," he said quietly. "I only seek truth. But if this chamber believes I can serve that truth with fairness, I will do my duty." 2 hours later, the review commenced in a formal hearing room below the Capitol. Press filled the gallery. State officials took their seats. Officers Sloan and Maddox were escorted in, no longer emboldened by uniform or silence. Sloan's hands twitched. Maddox stared at the floor pale. Langston sat at the head of the panel, flanked by 2 fellow judges. "This is not a spectacle," he opened. "This is a legal review to determine whether conduct violated both policy and principle. Evidence was presented, the body cam footage. The student video witness statements dispatch logs. Sloan's written report was dismantled line by line. Maddox admitted she had not verified Langston's ID nor questioned the order to handcuff him. Sloan attempted to defend his intuition, but his voice cracked under cross-examination. Langston remained steady, his tone firm, but not personal. "You were trained to de-escalate. You were trained to observe, to verify, to protect. You did none of those things." By evening, the panel delivered its verdict. Officers Sloan and Maddox were found in breach of duty, professional misconduct, and racial profiling. Immediate suspension without pay was enacted. A full criminal investigation was to follow. The chamber stood in silence as the judgment was read. Sloan didn't speak. Maddox nodded, once a tear sliding down her cheek. Langston rose. "Justice," he said, "must be blind to color, but never blind to truth. Let this be the beginning of that clarity." Outside the chamber, protesters had gathered in growing numbers. But when Langston stepped out, there was no roar, only silence. A heavy, reverent silence. Because justice in that moment had finally spoken. The hearing chamber inside the Michigan Capitol had never felt more alive or more haunted. Rows of polished oak benches were filled with journalists, legal experts, civil rights advocates, and members of the public lucky enough to secure a seat. Cameras were stationed at every corner, microphones angled forward like sentinels of truth. On the panel's elevated dais sat 3 judges. But at the center, calm and deliberate, was Judge Theodore Langston. No longer in handcuffs, no longer seated in a holding cell, but cloaked in the full dignity of his office. And yet beneath the robes and ritual, his hand still remembered the cold bite of metal. His voice, though clear, still echoed with the ache of being silenced. This was not just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning. The case was simple in form, but devastating in implication. Officers Garrett Sloan and Renee Maddox, seated stiffly at the defense table, were facing formal misconduct charges. racial profiling, illegal search, and seizure, unlawful detainment, and abuse of authority. But they were not the only ones on trial. The institution they served the badge, the code, the culture, was being dissected in full public view. And for the first time in a long time, the system was not the one asking questions, it was answering them. Langston began the proceedings with a tone colder than the air in the room. This hearing is convened to examine conduct unbecoming of law enforcement. We are not here to relitigate public perception. We are here to evaluate the facts that were caught on camera, witnessed by citizens, and now stand in judgment. His gaze moved briefly to Sloan, then to Maddox, before settling on the documents before him. He did not flinch. He did not blink. The same man they had profiled was now the one deciding whether they would keep their badges. The prosecution opened with a powerful sequence first. The viral video played in its entirety. The footage showed Langston's calm composure, his clear voice requesting clarification, the illegal search, the handcuffing. Gasps rippled through the room as Sloan's voice was heard dismissing. Consent barking orders treating the judge like a trespasser in his own skin. Then came the body cam footage, which told an even darker story, edited statements, language of intimidation, blatant disregard for rights. None of Sloan's official report matched what the footage revealed. Maddox, visibly shaken, lowered her eyes when her own silence was spotlighted. The prosecutors didn't attack her. They asked her why she said nothing, why she didn't run the ID, why she placed cuffs on a man who posed no threat. Her voice cracked. I was following protocol. I thought she stopped herself as if the truth had jammed in her throat. Langston watched her not with hatred, but with the weight of disappointed expectation. He had once believed the silent were merely complicit. Now he understood silence could be a symptom of fear. But that didn't make it harmless. When Sloan took the stand, he tried to regain control. He used phrases like reasonable suspicion, standard procedure, and gut instinct. But under cross-examination, his justifications collapsed. He admitted he hadn't checked Langston's ID. He admitted there was no confirmed stolen vehicle alert. He stumbled over legal definitions that, ironically, Langston himself had written opinions on. It wasn't just incompetence, it was exposure. The veil of presumed authority had been shredded. Throughout the hearing, Langston remained composed, but internally he wrestled with a storm. He had spent his life defending this system, mentoring young lawyers, believing reform could be shaped from the inside. And yet here he was proving what too many had screamed in protest. The system protects itself until it's forced to answer for its own reflection. Each testimony, each moment of denial, each hesitation, it was no longer just evidence. It was an indictment of a culture that had for too long mistaken power for righteousness. Closing arguments were brief but searing. The prosecution pointed to the pattern not a one-time mistake, but an expression of systemic rot. Defense counsel tried to paint Sloan as overwhelmed Maddox, as a junior officer caught in a difficult situation, but the evidence left no room for ambiguity. Langston took a moment before announcing the panel's decision. He looked down at his hands, once cuffed, now gripping the very law that had failed to protect him. His voice was steady, unyielding. This panel finds Officers Sloan and Maddox in violation of multiple legal and ethical standards. Their actions reflect negligence, racial bias, and a fundamental failure to uphold the Constitution they swore to defend. Effective immediately, both are suspended without pay. This matter will be referred for further criminal investigation by the State Attorney General. Gasps, silence, then stillness. Sloan stared blankly ahead. Maddox nodded once, as if bracing herself for something overdue. And Langston rose, not as a man seeking vindication, but as a symbol of what happens when justice finally stares back. Behind him, the flags of the state fluttered in a sudden breeze from an open window, as if even the air had shifted. Because for the first time in a long time, the system had been forced to sit on the other side of the bench. 3 weeks later, the steps of the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy looked different, not just because the media had thinned or the signs outside had changed, but because of the faces inside. 52 cadets dressed in crisp Navy uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder under the morning sun eyes, straight-ahead boots anchored to the ground. For the first time, they were graduating under a newly implemented code. One that included mandatory de-escalation training, racial bias awareness, and constitutional rights education. It was law enforcement rewritten from the inside out. And at the center of it, all invited, not as a cautionary tale, but as a founding voice, stood Judge Theodore Langston. He stood at the podium framed by the American flag and the seal of the Academy behind him. But his mind wasn't in the applause that greeted his presence. It was back in the rest stop under the sharp glare of suspicion. It was back in the cold holding chair, where his dignity had been measured against the color of his skin. It was back in the silence, the place where justice had nearly drowned. And now somehow here he was standing where the cycle began, not to relive it, but to end it. He adjusted the microphone with the same calm grace that had defined him through the hearing, through the headlines, through the humiliation. His voice rang out not loud but unshakable. 3 weeks ago I was handcuffed for sitting in my own vehicle wearing a suit reviewing case notes. I said nothing provocative. I gave no false statements. I offered my ID. I followed the law. And yet the law did not follow me. The silence among the cadets was reverent. No one blinked. No one shifted. The words didn't land like bullets, they landed like truth. I could have walked away bitter. I could have let rage consume me. But that's not why I stood firm. I stood because this profession, this badge, this oath must mean more than instinct and intimidation. It must mean judgment. It must mean courage, the courage to confront your bias before it becomes someone's trauma. Langston paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. There are those who will tell you that what happened to me was an isolated incident, he said. That's a lie we've told ourselves for decades. The truth is, what happened to me has happened in every city, every state, and every generation. The only difference is that I had a title and a camera. A few cadets swallowed hard. One young woman in the front blinked away tears. But your job, Langston continued, is not to protect a system that fears accountability. Your job is to build a system worthy of trust. That starts with how you see people not as threats, not as stereotypes, but as neighbors, as fathers, as mothers, as citizens who don't owe you fear in exchange for peace. He looked out over the sea of uniforms and saw something shift, not just in their posture, but in their awareness. These weren't just cadets, now they were witnesses. And witnesses carry weight. After the speech, as cadets filed out, one black recruit paused and turned back. He looked no older than 22, shoulder-squared eyes heavy with something deeper than pride. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. Langston nodded. "Go serve with honor." Outside, the breeze moved through the line of state flags overhead. Langston remained on the academy steps, letting the wind wash over him like absolution. He thought not of Sloan or Maddox, not of hearings or headlines, but of the thousands whose stories had never been recorded, whose voices had never reached the courtroom. He thought of the man he could have become angry, hollow resigned, but he hadn't. He had chosen a different legacy, one not built on punishment but on purpose. Because justice, he now understood, is not a destination, it's a standard, and standards don't rise on their own. They are lifted one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one refusal to stay silent when it's easier to look away. Langston turned from the academy steps and walked back to his car, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in truth. The journey wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid, and this time it bore his name. It was a quiet afternoon at the 12th Judicial Circuit Courthouse. No press, no protests, no spectacle. Just the hum of fluorescent lights above polished floors and the faint echo of law clerks shuffling papers behind oak-paneled doors. But down the center of the main hallway, framed by high arched ceilings and tall windows awash in golden light, walked a man who now meant something far larger than the robe he wore. Judge Theodore Langston, the man once mistaken for a criminal at a rest stop, now the symbol of a justice system forced to see itself moved, with measured steps toward his courtroom, not for a hearing, not for a ruling, but to take back what had been nearly stripped from him, not his position, but his peace. Outside, the world had kept moving. Officers Sloan and Maddox had been suspended pending criminal review, and a wave of departmental audits had begun statewide. Legal clinics had popped up in underserved communities offering free counsel to people wrongfully detained or profiled. Reform bills were circulating through the state legislature. Bias training standards were now being rewritten using footage of Langston's arrest as a core case study. But inside the courthouse, the walls remained unchanged. Same Latin inscriptions above doorways, same portraits of white justices staring down from a different era, their expressions frozen in time. It was as though the system itself refused to admit what it had done, and yet Langston kept walking. As he reached the doors of courtroom 3B, his courtroom, he paused. His reflection stared back from the brass handle, faint but distinct, a man shaped by law, betrayed by it, and yet still willing to serve it. The moment held weight. Behind those doors sat his bench, his gavel, his books. But they also held memories now. Every inch of that room had been altered by what happened, not physically, but spiritually. For Langston, justice would never again be theoretical. It had a face. His. He stepped inside. The room was empty except for his bailiff, who rose instinctively as he entered. Langston nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Slowly he approached the bench. The wood was cool beneath his fingertips, familiar yet foreign. He ran a hand along its edge, recalling the countless times he'd presided with composure and certainty. But now there was something more, a quiet awareness of how close justice could come to failing even those who dedicated their lives to it. He took his seat behind the bench, the elevated view now tinged with a different understanding. This was not just a seat of authority. It was a seat of responsibility, of humility, of vigilance. For years he had listened to stories from defendants, young black men pulled over without cause, searched without warrants, arrested without evidence. He had always believed them. But now he had lived it. He had felt the cuffs tighten, heard the doubt in their voices, experienced the silence that followed. And somehow in surviving it, he had not emerged smaller. He had emerged steadier. The chamber doors opened quietly. A court clerk entered to deliver a folder of new cases. She froze briefly when she saw him, then lowered her gaze. "Your Honor," she said softly, placing the file on the desk. He met her eyes not with weariness, but with a grounded intensity. "Thank you," he replied. She nodded, then exited, leaving him alone again in the stillness. Langston looked around. Sunlight filtered in through the high windows, catching the dust in midair like sparks. He exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but from acceptance. The system had tried to erase him and failed, but this wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. His bench was no longer a platform for rulings alone. It was now a watchtower, one that would no longer tolerate bias in shadows or silence in the face of injustice. He reached for his gavel, not to strike it, just to feel its weight. The same weight that had once judged others now rested in the hand of a man who had been judged unfairly, and had chosen not to retreat, but to return. Not with bitterness, but with resolve. Outside the courthouse, a breeze swept through the trees, scattering fallen leaves across the courthouse steps. And in that still moment, as Langston sat alone in the heart of a system he had both defended and been betrayed, by one truth echoed louder than any verdict: justice doesn't always move. Sometimes it stands still, waiting, watching, refusing to yield, until the world is ready to catch up. And Judge Theodore Langston, no longer just a name in a courtroom, had become the stillness that changed everything. The story of Judge Theodore Langston offers a profound reminder that dignity, truth, and justice must never depend on titles, appearances, or assumptions. It teaches us that even the most accomplished individuals, those who have spent their lives upholding the law, are not immune to the pain of prejudice. Yet more importantly, it shows the strength of choosing grace over bitterness, purpose over vengeance. In the face of wrongful arrest and public humiliation, Judge Langston stood firm, not to punish but to reform. His journey reminds us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but calm resistance rooted in truth can shake even the most unyielding systems. For the elderly who have witnessed decades of change, this story reaffirms a timeless truth that wisdom, patience, and quiet courage can still move mountains. Justice doesn't always shout. It often waits still and steady in the hands of those brave enough to carry it forward. No matter your age, your voice, presence, and example still matter. And perhaps the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't just what we achieve, but what we refuse to accept in the world we pass on. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment 1 if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one. Cops mock the black woman on trial, completely unaware she's the director of the Bureau for National Civil Security. A charged silence swept through the courtroom as the defendant, a composed black woman, stepped forward. At the prosecution's table, 2 smug police officers exchanged cocky glances, certain they were moments away from crushing her, from publicly humiliating her, for daring to defy their authority. But what they didn't know would shatter their confidence. She was no ordinary defendant. The balance of power was about to flip in a way no one saw coming, swift, brutal and unforgettable. Prejudice, buried secrets, and the weight of long overdue justice hung thick in the air. What began as a simple case was about to erupt into the most explosive trial the city had ever witnessed. A reckoning years in the making, and no one in that courtroom would leave untouched. The wind rolled low and thick across Portfield's east side that morning, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Willow Glen was a quiet, respectable neighborhood, the kind with creaking porch swings, fresh mulch in the flower beds, and retirees who still read the morning paper on their stoops. But beneath its orderly surface ran something more sinister, and on that particular morning it finally bubbled to the top. It began without warning. A black SUV pulled into the curb beside a modest single-story home, a well-kept brick house with a faded lawn sign that read, "Neighborhood Watch is watching you." The SUV door opened, and out stepped a woman in dark slacks and a crisp, high-collared blouse the color of midnight. She was in her early 40s, her hair pulled into a coiled braid, her posture flawless. She walked with the precise confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms where others whisper. Her name was Raven Sinclair, but no one in the neighborhood knew that. Not yet. As she approached the home, a commotion was already underway. 3 squad cars were parked at odd angles on the street, lights off, but presence loud. Officers stood in the front yard, some pretending to examine documents, others simply posturing. Wide stances, arms crossed, thumbs hooked on utility belts. 2 of them, Officer Ryan Caldwell and Officer Ethan Brooks, were already known in Portfield's more vulnerable neighborhoods, known not for service, but for intimidation. Raven clocked them immediately. The predatory alertness in Caldwell's eyes, the twitch of adrenaline in Brooks' jaw. She'd seen men like them before. She'd dismantled men like them before. She said nothing at first, merely observing. Something felt off. The police presence was too heavy, the energy too performative for a simple investigation. The house being swarmed belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez, a 74-year-old widow who had filed 2 civil complaints in the past year against Portfield PD. Raven had visited her last month, off the record, and now this, a random house check. Raven crossed the street and called out, calmly, respectfully, asking what was going on. Caldwell turned, lips already curling into a smirk. Brooks followed, scanning her face, then her clothes, calculating. "Ma'am," Caldwell said, voice laced with condescension, "this is an active investigation. You need to back away unless you want to get involved." Raven showed no reaction, only held her ground. "I have questions about the nature of this operation. This resident has raised concerns about prior harassment. Who approved this warrant?" The smirk vanished from Caldwell's mouth. "Who are you again?" Raven opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. "Not yet. Not here. Let them underestimate her. Let them play their hand." "I'm a concerned visitor," she said simply, "and I know the law well enough to know this looks excessive." Brooks chuckled. "Concerned visitor? This your street? No? Then walk, or I swear you'll be leaving in cuffs." She didn't flinch. That seemed to infuriate them both. The exchange was captured by a teenager on his phone from across the street. The boy had only started recording when the confrontation escalated, when Caldwell abruptly stepped forward and grabbed Raven's arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced force. Brooks moved in close, barking orders at no one in particular, as if conjuring an audience would justify the arrest. "Obstructing a police operation," he snapped. "She refused lawful orders. Get the cuffs." "She didn't do anything," someone yelled from a porch. "She was just talking." But the officers didn't pause. The cuffs snapped closed behind Raven's back with mechanical finality, the clink of metal echoing too loudly in the quiet neighborhood. In that moment, something passed between Raven and the crowd gathering at the edge of their yards. She looked up, not with panic, not with anger, but with a deliberate, icy calm. She scanned the street like a chess master reading the board mid-game. Her jaw was tight, her eyes like polished obsidian. She wasn't afraid. She was taking notes. And as Brooks shoved her toward the squad car, the boy across the street caught a close-up of her face. That image, a black woman in a navy blouse, hands bound, gaze steady, was posted online within minutes. No one in Portfield had heard the name Raven Sinclair in months. Her appointment hadn't made local headlines, Most in the courtroom that would soon try her case wouldn't recognize her, certainly not the smug officers who thought they'd just taught some arrogant troublemaker a lesson. But as the video spread first through neighborhood group chats, then city forums, then national feeds, questions erupted like wildfire. Who was she? Why was she arrested? And why did she look like she knew exactly what was about to happen? The storm had touched down. The city just didn't know it yet. The following Monday, the Portfield courthouse loomed like a relic of some old self-righteous empire, columns too tall, flags too stiff in the wind, and a security presence that felt more like a performance than protection. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the low thrum of journalists setting up tripods, lawyers adjusting ties, and citizens whispering behind folded newspapers. The air was thick with anticipation. No one could quite put their finger on why this particular case, the state of Illinois versus Raven Sinclair, felt different. The official charge was obstruction of a police investigation, the kind of offense that typically saw a quiet plea deal or a shrug from the press. But something about this woman, her composure, her silence, her refusal to issue any public statement, had cracked open the city's curiosity like a crowbar prying into rusted steel. Courtroom 3A filled to capacity within minutes. At the defense table sat Raven Sinclair, hands folded on the polished wood, dressed in a steel gray suit that matched the storm gathering outside. She looked serene, untouched by the noise around her. But her eyes were those of someone playing a long game, watchful, strategic, patient. Flanking her was Adrian Calloway, a defense attorney whose very presence was a signal that this case would be anything but ordinary. A legend in civil rights law, Adrian had spent the better part of 3 decades waging legal war against corrupt municipalities and crooked prosecutors. He didn't take cases for show, he took them to make someone bleed. Across the aisle, the prosecution exuded a different energy. Clara Hastings, assistant district attorney and rising star in Portfield's political circles, stood flanked by officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks, the 2 men who had arrested Raven in the now infamous video. Clara was sharp, stylish, and politically savvy. She'd made her name being tough but fair, and her ambition had teeth. Her posture was perfect, but beneath her polished veneer, her eyes flicked back to Raven too often, as though trying to peel away her calm to see what lay beneath. Caldwell and Brooks, for their part, carried themselves like men convinced the system was their shield. Caldwell wore a tailored suit over his broad frame, looking every inch the confident veteran officer, while Brooks sat tighter, more nervous, bouncing one knee as if still buzzing from the adrenaline of the arrest. They exchanged a few low, smug remarks before the session began, chuckling under their breath like schoolyard bullies, convinced they'd already won. Then the bailiff called the courtroom to order. Judge Helena Carter entered, robes sweeping behind her like shadows on marble. Known for her stern demeanor and intolerance for courtroom theatrics, she surveyed the room like a hawk. Her gavel hit the block with a sharp crack. "Let's proceed!" The opening statements began. Clara Hastings stood first, pacing slowly before the jury, a diverse group of 12 Portfield residents, most of them stone-faced, uncertain, still blinking off the morning fog. Clara's tone was crisp and confident. She painted Raven as a disruptive force, a woman who inserted herself recklessly into an ongoing police operation, endangering officers and undermining justice. Her voice was carefully modulated, professional, but laced with a patronizing undertone. Every time she said Ms. Sinclair, it came with the faintest curl of condescension, as though Raven were an unruly child who needed correcting. Caldwell and Brooks nodded solemnly at her words, trying to appear like dutiful civil servants who had simply followed protocol. But the atmosphere shifted when Adrian Calloway rose. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he approached the jury like a father telling a hard truth to his children. "What you're going to hear over the next few days will disturb you," he said, his voice a low thrum of conviction. Not because Ms. Sinclair is guilty, but because the officers seated across this room acted as if no one would ever hold them accountable. His eyes passed briefly over Caldwell and Brooks. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Caldwell forced a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Adrian continued, hinting at manipulated reports, missing footage, and a troubling history of misconduct buried beneath stacks of redacted files. He didn't reveal too much, not yet, but his closing remark landed like thunder. And when you learn who Ms. Sinclair really is, you'll understand why they were so eager to silence her. The room seemed to inhale as one. Judge Carter called for a recess. As people filed out into the hallway, the murmurs began. Who is she really? What are they hiding? And sitting silently at the defense table, Raven Sinclair simply smiled, just slightly, as if the match she'd struck had finally caught flame. By the time the jury reconvened after recess, the gallery was twice as crowded and 10 times more restless. Word had begun to ripple beyond the courtroom walls. Something about this woman, this Raven Sinclair, wasn't adding up. Not in the way the prosecution told it. She didn't flinch when accused. She didn't plead for mercy. She didn't look like someone running from accountability. She looked like someone marching toward it. And with every second that ticked by, more eyes were turning to her not as the defendant, but as the mystery at the heart of a very public reckoning. Adrian Calloway stood, once the judge resumed proceedings, calm and deliberate, like a man flipping over the first card in a long, carefully stacked deck. Your Honor, the defense calls Nina Delgado to the stand. Heads turned as a woman in her late 60s walked forward, her frame small but her presence striking. Nina's gray curls were pulled back, and she wore a maroon blazer pinned with a neighborhood watch badge. Her gait was slow but dignified. She was not a stranger to this courtroom. Years ago, she'd testified in a zoning case that helped prevent a corrupt housing development from bulldozing her block. People respected her, some feared her. And as she took the oath, her eyes never left the officers at the prosecution table. Nina, Adrian began gently, were you present on the day Raven Sinclair was arrested? Yes, she said, voice steady. I was walking my dog, Milo. We take the same route every morning. And what did you see? Nina's eyes narrowed slightly, as though pulling the memory into sharp focus. I saw 3 squad cars and a lot of noise for a street where nothing ever happens. Officers were moving around the yard like they were performing for someone. Then Ms. Sinclair approached them, calm, respectful, asking what was going on. She didn't raise her voice. She wasn't aggressive. She was firm, but never hostile. Adrian nodded, then gestured toward the jury. What happened next? Nina's expression darkened. One of the officers, the younger one, Brooks, I think, started barking orders. The older one, Caldwell, called her something under his breath. I won't repeat it, but it wasn't professional. Then suddenly they grabbed her, no warning, no reason. It was like they wanted to make an example of her. A hush fell over the room. Clara Hastings rose for cross-examination, her heels echoing like metronomes of precision. Ms. Delgado, you said you were across the street. How far exactly? 30 feet? 40? Maybe 35, Nina said coolly. So you wouldn't have heard every word exchanged between Ms. Sinclair and the officers, correct? Nina tilted her head. I heard enough, and I saw everything. Clara pressed on. And forgive me, but your eyesight at that distance. Do you wear glasses? For reading, Nina snapped. Not for seeing police mistreat someone in broad daylight. A ripple of laughter flickered through the gallery. Clara's lips tightened. Have you been active in local activism, Ms. Delgado? She asked, voice now laced with strategic skepticism. I've stood up when something smells wrong. If that's activism, then yes. She turned to the jury. And this? This reeks. Clara returned to her seat, offering no further questions. She knew better than to try and outmaneuver a witness who'd just won the room with a single phrase. As Nina stepped down, Adrian stood again. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to present surveillance footage from a home camera down the street. Judge Carter nodded. The lights dimmed, and on the screen above the jury, grainy black and white footage flickered to life. There was Raven, standing across the street, arms by her side, speaking, her body language calm, composed. Then, without any sign of escalation, Brooks stepped forward, hand on cuffs. Caldwell flanked her. She backed away slightly, holding out her palms. Then, in one sudden movement, they grabbed her and slammed her against the car. No sound, just pure motion. When the footage paused on Raven's restrained form, the gallery sat frozen. This, Adrian said, is what the officers called obstruction. He turned slowly to the jury. No yelling, no pushing, no crime. Just questions, and violence in return. Caldwell shifted in his seat. Brooks looked pale. Judge Carter leaned forward, her normally impassive face tight with thought. The mask was slipping now. Not just from the officer's narrative, but from the entire system's face. A woman had been arrested for daring to ask why. And now the jury was seeing exactly what that defiance cost her. Raven said nothing. But as the lights came back on and the prosecution scrambled to regroup, her silence spoke volumes. She was still waiting, watching, and they hadn't even begun to feel the storm she was about to unleash. The storm brewing inside the courtroom began to seep into the corridors of City Hall and the streets beyond. After the footage and Nina Delgado's damning testimony, murmurs of doubt whispered louder in Portfield's public forums, editorial pages, and local newsrooms. Social media exploded with speculation and fury. Who was Raven Sinclair? Why had officers Caldwell and Brooks reacted so violently? And why did their story seem thinner with each passing witness? As the city teetered on the edge of a civic reckoning inside the courtroom, the case was shifting from a straightforward defense into a high-stakes psychological duel, a battle not just of facts, but of perception, memory, and motive. Adrian Calloway sensed it. He stood at the defense table reviewing his notes while the jury filed back into their box, eyes sharper now, less neutral. They were watching everyone with quiet intensity. Even Judge Helena Carter, so carefully restrained in her demeanor, had begun to lean forward more often, her eyes flicking toward the prosecution with subtle scrutiny. Adrian rose. The defense calls Dr. Alana Pierce to the stand. All eyes turned as a poised black woman in her early 50s walked confidently to the witness box. Dr. Pierce, a forensic psychologist renowned for her work in racial trauma and police-civilian dynamics, was no stranger to controversial cases. Her presence signaled a new phase of the trial, one that would crack open not just the incident, but the mindset behind it. Dr. Pierce, Adrian began, can you help the jury understand how repeated exposure to law enforcement harassment affects the psychology of those targeted? She nodded, folding her hands. Certainly. What I've observed in my 2 decades of research is that individuals, especially those from historically marginalized communities, develop a form of hypervigilance. It's a survival mechanism. When someone like Mrs. Sinclair sees a cluster of police surrounding a home in her neighborhood, especially knowing that the resident is elderly and vulnerable, her instinct isn't confrontation, it's concern. But to officers operating within a system that often dehumanizes those same communities, that concern can be misread, or worse, weaponized. A murmur passed through the gallery. Adrian let the words hang. And in your expert opinion, he continued, did the footage we reviewed earlier suggest any behavior from Ms. Sinclair that could be interpreted as hostile? No, Dr. Pierce said firmly. She displayed classic signs of regulation. Open palms, calm gestures, a lowered voice. She was trying to de-escalate. And how would an officer, one already conditioned to view certain bodies as threatening, interpret those gestures? If that officer carries implicit or explicit bias, Pierce answered, they might interpret even peaceful behavior as defiance, especially if the civilian is black and questioning authority. Clara Hastings objected, but too late. The words had landed. During cross-examination, Clara attempted to poke holes. Dr. Pierce, you weren't there. You didn't hear the tone of voice. Couldn't her body language have shifted before or after the footage? Pierce remained steady. The footage is clear. The officers escalated, not Ms. Sinclair. Clara's jaw tensed as she returned to her seat, her arguments beginning to fray. The next move came swiftly. Adrian called for Officer Ryan Caldwell to take the stand. The defense had secured his testimony under subpoena. The courtroom held its collective breath as the veteran officer approached, his confident stride a little less certain than the day before. Under direct examination from Clara, Caldwell reiterated hhis version of events. Ms. Sinclair was obstructive, aggressive, and threatened to make calls that would bring down hell on them. He spoke with rehearsed authority, but his eyes darted too much, searching the jury, the judge, and finally resting uneasily on Raven. Then Adrian stepped forward. Officer Caldwell, he began, his tone measured but laced with steel, you claim Ms. Sinclair made threats. Are those threats recorded on your body cam? A pause. There was an issue with the cam that day. Adrian raised an eyebrow. A malfunction? Caldwell nodded. Yes. And Officer Brooks's cam? Same issue. So you're asking this jury to believe that both your body cams failed at the exact moment Ms. Sinclair allegedly threatened you? Caldwell bristled. It's happened before. These things aren't perfect. Adrian walked to the evidence monitor. Let's consult department maintenance logs. According to these, both devices were tested and approved less than 24 hours before the arrest. No reports of malfunction. Silence. Adrian leaned closer. Officer Caldwell, isn't it true that this isn't the first time your body comm has failed during a civilian complaint? Objection. Overruled. Caldwell squirmed. I don't recall. No? Adrian held up a copy of an internal affairs complaint. One from a black teen detained last year under suspicious circumstances. The footage? Lost. The officer? Caldwell. The courtroom was ice cold now, every juror leaning in. Caldwell's facade was cracking, sweat now gathering at his brow. He stole a glance at Brooks, whose face had gone ghostly. And still, Raven Sinclair had not said a word. She sat quietly, her eyes steady, watching the prosecution's mask slide inch by inch off its face. The chessboard was set. The next move would be devastating. By the time the fifth day of testimony dawned, the courthouse had become a pressure cooker of whispers, headlines, and building outrage. What had begun as a small-town trial for a minor obstruction charge now pulsed through the veins of national discourse. Satellite trucks lined the curb outside the Portfield courthouse, their long antennae pointed skyward like metallic trees seeking a signal from the gods. Inside, the energy had changed. No longer a detached legal proceeding. This had become something else, something bigger. People were no longer watching to see if Raven Sinclair was innocent. They were watching to see how far the rot went. When Adrian Calloway entered the courtroom that morning, he was flanked by Raven and her assistant Maya, both solemn but composed. Raven wore a deep forest green suit, understated yet sharp, her eyes focused and unreadable. She hadn't spoken publicly, hadn't given a single interview or statement. But her silence had only deepened the intrigue. The public had begun to refer to her online as the woman they underestimated, and now they were waiting to see how long that underestimation would hold. Today's strategy was about leverage. Adrian knew the officers' stories were unraveling, but now it was time to apply pressure in a new way, by shaking the prosecution's foundation with the unexpected appearance of allies no one expected. As the crowd settled and the judge banged her gavel, Adrian stood and called his next witness, Reverend Elijah Hawthorne. A quiet hush fell over the gallery as the tall, silver-haired minister stepped up to the stand. Elijah was no ordinary preacher. He was a civil rights icon in the region, his presence at community protests and city hall hearings stretching back 3 decades. When he took the oath, the weight of history seemed to echo through his voice. Reverend Hawthorne, Adrian began, can you describe your relationship to the events that led to Ms. Sinclair's arrest? I wasn't there that day, the Reverend replied, but I've known Raven Sinclair long before Portfield ever did. And I know the pattern that runs through this courtroom. Different uniforms, same sickness. He then spoke of countless complaints made against officers Caldwell and Brooks, complaints from young men, single mothers, elderly residents, people who lacked the power or status to challenge authority. His words were not angry, they were grieved. What happened to Ms. Sinclair is not new, he said. The only thing new is that someone finally had the standing to make it undeniable. Adrian let the Reverend's words hang in the air before nodding to Maya, who opened the doors at the back of the gallery. In walked Vanessa Holloway, and the room gasped. Once a staunch conservative columnist and vocal law and order advocate, Vanessa had been known to defend the Portfield Police Department without hesitation. But last year her teenage son had been stopped and frisked by officers without cause, and when she'd filed a complaint, she received nothing but silence. She had kept quiet publicly, until now. Under oath, Vanessa told the jury, I spent years believing the system worked because it worked for me, until it didn't. And when I saw Ms. Sinclair arrested, I saw my son. I saw every mother who never got an apology. The gallery was frozen. Even Judge Helena Carter seemed shaken. Clara Hastings looked rattled, flipping through her notes as if a strategy might suddenly materialize. Behind her, officers Caldwell and Brooks sat stiffly, their earlier swagger now fossilized into something brittle and afraid. But Adrian wasn't finished. He called to the stand Sergeant Javier Dominguez, a 20-year veteran of the Portfield PD, known for being quiet, reliable, and until now completely silent about his department's inner workings. Dominguez, called under subpoena, looked nervous but determined. He testified that he had arrived at the scene minutes after Raven's arrest and found her in cuffs, shaken but composed. More damningly, he confirmed that both Caldwell and Brooks' body cams were inexplicably powered off, violating clear departmental protocol. Then came the crack in the wall. "I filed 2 internal reports against Officer Caldwell in the past 5 years," Dominguez said, voice low but clear. Both were quietly dismissed. One involved excessive force. The other, racially charged language during a traffic stop. The gallery erupted. Judge Carter called for silence, banging her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. On the prosecution's bench, Clara's face was pale. She tried to regain control with a tense cross-examination, accusing Dominguez of holding a personal grudge, but his answers were calm, unwavering. "This isn't about a grudge. It's about truth." As Dominguez stepped down, Adrian turned briefly toward Raven, who met his gaze and gave a single, slow nod. The tide had turned. The court no longer saw Raven as a defendant. It saw her as a fault line, one that had cracked wide open the illusion of law without prejudice. And now, no one knew how far the quake would reach. The tension inside the courtroom had grown into something living, tangible, thick and heavy, like the air before a summer storm. Every glance, every shuffle of paper, every subtle breath from the jury carried weight. People were no longer here just for the trial. They were here for the unraveling. The once confident facade of Officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks had begun to show cracks, hairline fractures that widened with each day. The courtroom gallery, once polite and reserved, now held a mixture of hushed defiance and cautious hope. Every morning, the line outside the courthouse grew longer. The people of Portfield weren't just watching this case anymore. They were waiting for justice to wake up. Adrian Calloway stepped into the courtroom that morning with the expression of a man holding a blade behind his back. He'd seen the games prosecutors played. He'd seen how systems protected themselves, how misplaced files and missing footage had a habit of smothering truth before it could speak. But not this time. Not with Raven Sinclair sitting beside him, composed, watchful, a living reminder that power could be graceful and furious all at once. Her silence up until now wasn't weakness. It was calculation. She was waiting for the moment when her truth would strike like thunder. The gallery stirred when the first unexpected figure entered. Reverend Elijah Hawthorne, tall and solemn in a dark overcoat, his presence as commanding as any official in the room. A lifelong civil rights advocate and the spiritual cornerstone of Portfield's black community, his arrival sent a message louder than any protest chant. The people were watching, and the people remembered. Following him was Vanessa Holloway, a former conservative commentator whose scathing editorials once praised the Portfield PD as pillars of order. But all of that changed the day her teenage son was wrongfully stopped and searched by Officer Caldwell. That day shattered her beliefs. And now, she too was here, her presence carrying the weight of penance and conviction. As the judge gavelled in the session, Adrian rose. "Your Honor, the defense calls Reverend Elijah Hawthorne." Whispers rippled through the gallery as the Reverend stepped to the stand, raising his right hand with the gravitas of a man preparing to testify not just for the court, but for history. His voice was calm but powerful, each word landing with precision. "I've been in Portfield for 40 years, he said. "I've buried sons who shouldn't have died, and I've sat with mothers who asked why the badge never apologized. Today, I sit here because this city has a chance to do more than mourn. It has a chance to correct." He spoke of Raven Sinclair not just as a defendant, but as a woman of principle, someone he'd crossed paths with years before when she was quietly investigating discriminatory policing policies across the state. He described a pattern of abuse from certain officers like Caldwell and Brooks, whose behavior had been tolerated for too long. Their uniform were used not to protect, but to intimidate. Next, Vanessa Holloway took the stand. Her testimony was quieter, more personal. She described the fear in her son's eyes, the indignity of knowing her wealth and status couldn't shield her family from prejudice. "I used to write about law and order like it was sacred," she said, voice trembling. "But a order without justice is just control." The courtroom was silent. Clara Hastings shifted in her seat, her once unshakable confidence now dulled into caution. She tried to object, to pivot, to distract, but each objection landed with less conviction than the last. Every effort to redirect the narrative now felt more like deflection, and then Adrian dropped the hammer. The defense calls Sergeant Javier Dominguez. The gallery gasped. Dominguez had served on the force for over 2 decades, respected, quiet, not known for choosing sides. But here he was, summoned under subpoena. His expression haunted and reluctant. Under Adrian's questioning, he admitted what few officers ever did, that he had witnessed questionable behavior by Caldwell and Brooks firsthand. He recalled internal reports he had filed, reports that disappeared. He admitted that he had grown afraid, not of criminals, but of his own department's silence. "I saw Ms. Sinclair in cuffs that day," Dominguez said. "She wasn't resisting, she wasn't threatening, she was asking questions. That's not a crime." When Clara cross-examined, she accused Dominguez of harboring resentment, of using this trial to settle scores. But he didn't budge. "The truth doesn't need a grudge," he replied. "It just needs to be told." As he stepped down, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The foundation beneath the prosecution's case had been rattled again. And Raven? She didn't speak, didn't move. But something had shifted in her gaze, something colder, sharper. The storm was no longer on its way. It had arrived. And the question now wasn't whether the courtroom could withstand it. It was whether Portfield itself could. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, the air humming with electricity. Rumors had been swirling since the previous afternoon. Something big was coming. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised, cameras silently clicking at intervals. Jurors sat stiff-backed, wide-eyed, their expressions betraying anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Even Judge Helena Carter seemed more alert than usual, her fingers twitching slightly at the edge of her bench. Outside, the line of people trying to enter the courthouse wrapped around the block. And at the heart of it all sat Raven Sinclair, silent, composed, perfectly still, like the eye of the storm she herself had summoned. Adrian Calloway stood beside her, his voice calm, but with a current of restrained power. "Your Honor, the defense would now like to call Ms. Raven Sinclair to the stand." A ripple passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. The jury turned to watch her rise. She moved slowly, deliberately, the heels of her shoes echoing across the floor with each step toward the witness chair. Maya, seated in the gallery, glanced up from her notes with a flicker of nervous pride. This was the moment they'd been building toward, not just a defense, but a revelation. Raven took the oath with quiet confidence, her right hand raised, her voice firm and unwavering. Once seated, Adrian approached with the reverence of a man standing on the edge of history. "Miss Sinclair," he began, "please tell the court about your background." Raven's gaze swept the courtroom, not defiantly, but purposefully. "I was born in Charleston, South Carolina," she said, her voice smooth and low. "My father was a Baptist minister and my mother a public school principal. I learned early what it meant to live under the weight of both expectation and injustice." She went on to explain her education, degrees in political science and criminal justice, her work in the FBI, her years spent specializing in civil rights investigations, and counterterrorism. Each detail added another layer to the figure once perceived as nothing more than a civilian interloper. The courtroom listened in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the image of a woman handcuffed on a sidewalk with the credentials now being recited with chilling clarity. Adrian took a slow breath before delivering the final question. "And what is your current role, Ms. Sinclair?" Raven didn't hesitate. "I am the director of the National Civil Security Bureau, under the Department of Homeland Security. I was appointed 4 months ago by presidential order." The silence shattered. The gallery erupted into gasps, reporters scribbled furiously, and even a few jurors' mouths fell open. Judge Carter slammed her gavel once, then twice. "Order! Order in the court!" But the order had already been broken. At the prosecution table, Clara Hastings froze mid-note, her face a mask of disbelief. Caldwell paled visibly, his eyes darting around the room, while Brooks sank into his chair like a man watching the tide rise around his neck. Adrian let the chaos settle before he turned back to Raven. "And on the day of your arrest, what was your reason for being on Alder Street?" "I was conducting an unannounced, independent audit of civil rights compliance in local police activity," she said. "The house under surveillance belonged to a woman I had met during prior outreach. I approached the officers out of concern for excessive force. I never raised my voice. I never interfered with their operation. I only asked questions. And were you arrested without cause?" "Yes," she said flatly. Because they saw a black woman asking questions. That was all the cause they needed. The courtroom fell into a breathless silence again, not out of disbelief, but out of recognition. What had once seemed like an ambiguous case now stood fully exposed. Raven hadn't just been wrongly arrested, she'd been silenced by a system that never thought to ask who she truly was. Her final words before stepping down struck with poetic finality. "I didn't come here to pull rank. I came here to remind you that power without accountability is just oppression dressed in uniform." And with that, she returned to her seat, while the courtroom reeled from the weight of truth dropped like a hammer in its midst. The tide had not only turned, it had thundered ashore. The revelation of Raven Sinclair's identity had detonated through the courtroom like a slow-moving explosion, every word of her testimony still echoing in the stunned silence that followed. But as the jury and the public reeled, Adrian Calloway was already moving into the final, most dangerous phase of his strategy: total exposure. Now that Raven's truth had shattered the prosecution's illusion, it was time to finish peeling back the layers of deception surrounding the Westbridge Police Department and its chosen defenders. The day's proceedings began not with a whisper, but with a collision, between the story the officers had carefully crafted and the damning facts waiting in the wings. Adrian stepped before the jury with a new level of intensity in his tone. "Your Honor, the defense requests permission to call a rebuttal witness, Officer Devin Marks." There was a stir in the gallery. No one had heard the name before, but Clara Hastings looked up sharply, her spine straightening. She recognized it, and she knew what was coming. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a young man in uniform entered, nervous and pale. Officer Marks was slight, with anxious eyes and the stiff posture of someone who'd spent days weighing whether to speak or to disappear. He approached the witness stand like a soldier crossing a minefield, glancing once toward the prosecution's table, then quickly away. Once sworn in, Adrian approached carefully. "Officer Marks, you work in the Westbridge PD Digital Evidence Unit, correct?" "Yes," Marks replied, his voice thin but steady. "I handle technical review and storage of body cam and surveillance footage." "And were you on duty the day of Ms. Sinclair's arrest?" "I was." Adrian's next question came like a knife. "Did you receive any requests concerning the body cam footage from that day?" A pause, a swallow, then, "Yes." "I was asked to modify the logs." The room inhaled as one. Adrian stepped closer. "What do you mean by modify?" Marks hesitated, his face pale. "Lieutenant Avery instructed me to backdate a malfunction report for both Officer Caldwell's and Officer Brooks's body cams. He said it was just a paperwork correction, but it wasn't. The footage was there, at first. And what happened to it? I was told to delete it, not just move it, erase it. He said the case was minor and the optics were bad." "Did Officers Caldwell and Brooks know about this?" Marks looked down. "Yes. They were CC'd in the request, and Officer Brooks followed up with me personally, told me to clean the mess so it didn't come back on them." The gallery exploded into whispers. Judge Carter hammered her gavel again and again, but the room had turned electric. Clara Hastings looked like a woman cornered. She quickly stood demanding that Officer Marks be held in contempt for violating departmental confidentiality. Adrian countered immediately. "The people have a right to know when justice is manipulated from the inside." Judge Carter allowed the testimony to stand. The tide was now irreversible. Then came the final blow. Adrian displayed a newly admitted exhibit, a string of internal emails, recovered through Raven's federal clearance, showing a months-long pattern of Caldwell and Brooks routinely deleting footage or filing malfunctions, most of them following incidents involving minority civilians. Dozens of them. And in nearly every case, Internal Affairs had ruled the complaints inconclusive, due to lack of available evidence. There was no recovering from it. The prosecution sat frozen. Clara stared blankly at the screen as her star witnesses unraveled before her eyes. Brooks looked ashen, his foot tapping under the table like he was ready to bolt. Caldwell clenched his jaw so tight the muscles twitched. The courtroom had become a crucible. Every illusion of integrity surrounding the officers had melted away, leaving behind only the raw, uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about Raven anymore. This was about everyone they had silenced, every neighborhood they had terrorized, every complaint that had vanished without a trace, And at the center of it all, Raven sat silent once again, watching the scales tip. But this time, it wasn't just her life hanging in the balance. It was the entire system. And the whole world was finally watching. By the 9th day, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It felt like a battlefield of truth. The grandeur of the judge's bench, the polished sheen of the marble floors, the hum of murmuring spectators, it all seemed thin, barely able to contain the seismic tension crackling beneath. The once smug prosecution was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Clara Hastings, once poised and calculating, now looked like a gambler watching her last chip slide across the table. Officers Ryan Caldwell and Ethan Brooks sat like shadows of themselves, their posture rigid, their expressions cracked with anxiety. They had arrived here with the armor of uniforms and the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. That armor was now shattered, replaced by sweat-slicked brows, darting eyes, and silence that spoke louder than any of their past bravado. And Raven Sinclair, she remained still, calm, almost unsettlingly so. She sat with her hands folded not as a victim seeking redemption, but as a sentinel watching the fire she had lit spread to every corner of the courtroom. Her truth had been laid bare, her credentials confirmed, and the false narrative the officers had so confidently spun was now ash beneath the relentless weight of testimony, footage, and damning internal documents. But Raven knew the collapse wasn't complete. Not yet. Adrian Calloway stood with a quiet authority that had only grown more commanding with each passing day. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Helena Carter, "the defense would like to recall Officer Ethan Brooks to the stand for additional testimony." Brooks's head jerked toward his attorney, whose whispered objections fell flat against the inevitability of the moment. Reluctantly, Brooks stood, his hands twitching slightly as he returned to the witness box. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by tight lips, reddened cheeks, and the posture of a man backed into a corner. Adrian approached slowly, almost gently. "Officer Brooks, you testified last week that Ms. Sinclair verbally threatened you and Officer Caldwell. You said she attempted to interfere with an active police investigation, correct?" "Yes," Brooks said, barely above a whisper. Adrian nodded. "We've since heard testimony from 3 eyewitnesses, 2 digital forensic experts, a psychologist, and Sergeant Javier Dominguez, all of whom dispute your account. We've seen video footage contradicting your timeline. We've reviewed internal complaints that place your credibility in question. So, let me ask again, under oath, did Ms. Sinclair threaten you?" A beat. Brooks stared at the floor. The silence stretched long enough for the gallery to begin leaning forward in unison. "No," he finally muttered. "Not exactly." "What did she say?" "She asked questions," he admitted. "About the warrant, about our procedure." "And was that a threat, Officer Brooks?" "No." Adrian nodded slowly. "Thank you. One more question. Why did you follow up with Officer Marks about the footage?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want things to get out of hand. She was a federal officer and I panicked." "So you knew who she was?" "Not at first," Brooks said quickly. "But when I found out later, I was scared. We knew it was bad." "Scared of accountability?" Adrian asked. Brooks didn't answer. The courtroom murmured again, louder this time. Adrian turned toward Judge Carter. The defense rests its case. It was like the final tile falling in a chain reaction. Clara Hastings stood only to say she had no more witnesses, her voice thin and dry. She didn't bother with a passionate closing, only a procedural one, delivered like a formality she no longer believed in. The illusion of certainty she had projected throughout the trial had disintegrated. She looked defeated, and perhaps deep down, ashamed. That night, news outlets ran the footage from inside the courtroom, splicing Brooks' reluctant confession with Raven's testimony and expert analysis. Clips went viral, people calling her the woman who unmasked the lie, the silence breaker, the reckoning in a navy suit. Hashtags lit up. Number Justice for Raven, number Portfield Reckoning, number Truth in Uniform. Inside the courtroom the next day, Caldwell asked to address the court. His voice shook as he offered a public apology, stammered, incomplete but real. Brooks followed, his face pale, admitting they had let fear and bias guide their actions. Raven listened quietly. She didn't gloat. She didn't even flinch. When asked if she had anything to say in response, she stood and said, "Acknowledgement is not absolution, but it is a start." And just like that, the final breath of their lie was exhaled. The mask had fallen. And the city of Portfield was now staring at the truth it could no longer ignore. The 10th day arrived with a strange stillness, as if the city of Portfield was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, the energy was taut and electric, the kind of tension that clings to skin and makes the air feel heavier than it should. Reporters were shoulder to shoulder, their equipment humming with anticipation. Protesters and supporters of Raven Sinclair filled the steps outside, holding signs, hands clasped, faces turned toward the courthouse windows like they might catch a glimpse of history happening inside. The jury had been deliberating for less than a day, but already the collective sense was that the truth had long since spoken. All that remained was for the law to acknowledge it. Raven sat motionless at the defense table, flanked by Adrian Calloway and Maya, her ever-steady assistant. Her hands were folded, her eyes forward, expression unreadable. The calm she radiated wasn't complacency, it was resolve. She had faced the weight of the system and stood her ground. She had exposed the machinery behind the badges, laid bare the rot that had festered behind sealed records and official reports. But now even she could feel the tremble in the air, as if something ancient and deeply rooted was about to be judged. The courtroom door opened. "All rise," the bailiff called. The jury filed in, every face a mask of solemn gravity. Not a whisper stirred. Judge Helena Carter's voice was steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her tightly wound hair and a backbone of steel in her posture, rose with a folded slip in her hand. She handed it to the bailiff, who in turn passed it to the judge. A beat of silence passed as Judge Carter read the verdict. Then her voice rang out across the courtroom. "On the charge of false arrest, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of filing falsified police reports, guilty." The air exploded. Gasps, shouts, tears, applause stifled by the sharp banging of Judge Carter's gavel. But no amount of wood against wood could erase the sound of vindication echoing through that chamber. Caldwell sat with his head bowed, his fists clenched tight against the arms of his chair. Beside him, Brooks looked as though his skeleton had been hollowed out, all the swagger of earlier days drained away, replaced by the heavy silence of reckoning. Clara Hastings closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, as though releasing the last breath of a truth she had tried not to see. For her, this trial had started as a career move, a quick conviction wrapped in the optics of order. But now she looked like a woman who'd stood too close to the fire and realized, too late, it was justice burning through the lies. Judge Carter's voice, steady, but not without feeling, continued. "Given the gravity of the charges and the compelling evidence of systemic misconduct, sentencing will be scheduled for next month. In the meantime, Officers Caldwell and Brooks are remanded to federal custody under electronic monitoring. Their employment with the Portfield Police Department is terminated effective immediately." The officers were led out not with defiance, but with the quiet submission of men who knew the end had come. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Flashbulbs exploded. But Raven didn't flinch. She stood slowly, turning, not to the cameras, but to the faces in the gallery, faces that had watched, waited, wept. She walked over to Reverend Elijah Hawthorne, who stood to greet her with quiet reverence. Vanessa Holloway offered a soft smile, tears in her eyes, her pen finally still. Maya stood beside Raven with pride radiating from her in waves. A reporter managed to push forward, mic in hand. "Ms. Sinclair, do you have anything to say to the public?" Raven paused, looked straight into the lens, and said, "Accountability is not vengeance. It is the beginning of healing. Today wasn't just a verdict for me, it was a mirror held up to a system that has too often refused to see itself. If you're watching this and wondering what comes next, it's up to all of us." And with that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom. Not as the accused, but as a catalyst. As a woman who had stood in silence while the storm gathered, and then made the thunder speak. The gavel may have closed the trial, but Raven Sinclair had opened something far more powerful, the first real crack in a wall that for too long had seemed immovable. Now, with the whole nation watching, change wasn't just coming. It had already begun. Weeks passed, but the ripple effects of the trial had only just begun to settle, and even then the ground beneath Portfield still felt unstable, like something fundamental had shifted. The city, once cloaked in the illusion of order and fairness, now stood raw and exposed under a spotlight it could no longer dim. The Westbridge Police Department announced a full internal overhaul, though many suspected it was more survival tactic than repentance. Several top officials quietly resigned or were reassigned. A federal oversight task force, co-chaired by none other than Raven Sinclair, began auditing departments across the state, targeting those with decades-long patterns of suppressed complaints and manipulated evidence. What had started as a personal battle had ignited a statewide and potentially national reckoning. Raven never returned to anonymity, but she never sought the spotlight either. When national media outlets requested interviews, she gave one, and only one, an unscripted sit-down, where she talked not about her own story, but about the thousands who would never get their day in court. Justice, she said, is not a moment. It's a muscle. If we don't use it, it forgets how to work. The clip went viral, played on every major network, turned into quotes on murals, and printed on t-shirts worn at rallies across the country. Maya remained by her side, now promoted to senior advisor for community engagement. Adrian Calloway received so many calls from potential clients and civil rights organizations that his modest office became a hub for whistleblowers and wronged citizens ready to speak. Vanessa Holloway began a column titled "Bridging the Divide," dedicated to police accountability. And Reverend Elijah Hawthorne spearheaded a city-funded initiative to train young leaders in public advocacy. But it was one quiet moment, weeks later, that defined everything. Raven returned to Alder Street, where it all began. The neighborhood had changed. Flowers blooming, sidewalks swept clean, children playing freely. An elderly woman waved from her porch, her eyes brimming with gratitude. On the side of a community center nearby, a mural stretched across the brick wall. Raven's silhouette, standing tall amid fractured badges, surrounded by words painted in bold strokes. Truth doesn't whisper forever. One day it roars. And that roar, Raven knew, had only just begun. In today's world, Raven Sinclair's story is more than fiction, it's a mirror. Her fight against abuse of power and systemic bias reflects the lived experiences of countless individuals who face discrimination, intimidation, or injustice simply for speaking up or asking questions. It reminds us that even those who enforce the law are not above it, and that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to grow. The most powerful lesson we can take from Raven's journey is this: truth has power, but it needs courage to bring it to light. Whether we're community leaders, students, or everyday citizens, we all have a role in demanding accountability, protecting the vulnerable, and speaking up when we see something wrong. Because change doesn't come from waiting, it comes from standing up, just like Raven did, and refusing to be silenced when it matters most. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts. When a retired black professor is stalked by police on a quiet evening walk, what unfolds becomes a national reckoning. One woman, one dog, and a drone exposed the truth they never saw coming. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you like thrilling, gripping stories, don't forget to subscribe. The Santa Clara sky bled into shades of copper and bruised lavender as Helena Whitmore looped the leash onto Valor's collar with hands steadier than her thoughts. The air carried the salted breath of the Pacific soft and familiar, brushing her face like the memory of a kiss too far gone to chase. It was the hour she once loved most, the tender quiet, before darkness settled in when the world pretended to be at peace. But tonight that stillness didn't soothe. It stalked. It pressed in from the edges. It reminded her that peace in America had always been selective, and she'd never been its intended recipient. Her fingers lingered at her throat, brushing the cold metal tags that nestled just beneath her sweater. Naomi's tags. Worn warm by skin and years, they sat like armor on her chest. The military had given her wife a folded flag, a plastic plaque, and a 90-second speech. But Naomi had left Helena something far greater: valor. The last dog she'd trained, the last living remnant of a life forged in uniform and defiance. He was no ordinary dog. His gaze didn't just scan it calculated. His steps weren't just movement, they were memory mission. People thought dogs followed commands. Naomi used to say, "The right ones follow your soul." And Valor followed Helena like he could hear her heartbeat before she spoke. They walked the same path they always had, a narrow trail above the sea cliffs where eucalyptus trees swayed and wildflowers whispered through the dust. But something had shifted. The wind still carried ocean salt, but it was laced now with something sour. The quiet of the neighborhood wasn't friendly anymore. It was watchful, like the silence after a slammed door. 3 weeks ago the cruiser had appeared. No sirens, no calls. Just parked angled, not observing, but claiming. Helena had noticed it the first time and said nothing. The second time her fingers had tensed around Valor's leash. By the third she knew better than to pretend. That cruiser didn't belong to this part of town, and neither did the men inside it. Sergeant Logan Price, with his performative smile and spit-shined boots, who wore civility like a costume stitched too tight. Officer Elias Carter, who laughed too loud, when no one else was joking, who clutched his baton like a prop and a promise. And then Matt Riley, barely out of academy, his nervous glances sharp as broken glass, trying to be a man in a wolf pack without knowing how to leave it. They watched her. Every evening. Every step. And still she walked. Because walking wasn't just ritual, it was rebellion. Helena knew what they saw: a black woman aging with too much pride. A war dog, too disciplined to entertain. A pair that didn't flinch. They weren't used to that. Not here. Not in a seaside town that liked its black residents quiet, agreeable, grateful. Helena had been all those things once. She had smiled when her students asked if she really had a PhD. She had apologized when hotel clerks accidentally gave her the wrong key. She had even lowered her voice when her late wife was called a friend in church prayer lists. But not anymore. Not after Naomi. Not after the graveside salute. Not after the system she paid taxes to ask her to mourn quietly, to grieve politely. A sharp bark from Valor jolted her back to now. He stood still, ears perked, body a taut line of muscle and vigilance. Ahead, 2 blocks down, the cruiser sat again. Engine on. Lights off. Waiting. Watching. Like they owned the road. Helena's breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from memory. Her therapist once told her that trauma doesn't announce itself. It arrives in the breath you didn't know you were holding. She let the air out slowly and reminded herself what Naomi used to say when the world pressed too close. Walk like they can't erase you. So she did. Each footstep was deliberate, echoing against pavement and coastline. Her stride wasn't long, but it was proud. She didn't look toward the cruiser. She didn't speed up, didn't slow down. Her fingers tightened just slightly around the leash, and Valor responded in kind, his pace matching hers, with mechanical precision. But beneath her resolve something ancient stirred. Rage not hot and reckless, but slow and generational. The kind passed down like recipes and warnings. The kind that whispered, "You don't get to just exist here, you have to justify it, and even that may not be enough." She reached the bend in the trail, the point where eucalyptus gave way to street lamps. She didn't stop. Not even when the cruiser's engine purred closer, slow, deliberate, like it didn't need to hide. It had the badge, the authority, the camouflage of concern. Valor growled low, the sound more vibration than voice. Helena didn't flinch. She just whispered, "Not yet." Because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. But it was coming. She could feel it in the way the birds had stopped singing. In the way no one waved anymore. In the way even the breeze seemed to hush when the patrol car crawled by. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere 3 blocks away a teenage boy was launching a drone from his back porch, testing out a new stabilizer on the fading sun. He wasn't aiming for justice. He was just filming the coast. But fate has a way of filming what needs to be seen. And Helena Whitmore, dog tags warm against her chest, war dog beside her cruiser, stalking her shadow, had already decided she would not shrink. Not this time. Not ever again. At first it had been subtle. A shadow where there shouldn't have been one. A patrol cruiser idling at the edge of her block longer than necessary. A glance that lingered from the front seat just a beat too long. Helena Whitmore, a woman who had studied silence for decades, both as a linguist and a black woman in America, knew the difference between a glance and a gaze. What she felt now was a gaze. One that watched without blinking, waiting not for her to stumble, but to exist in a way they could deem inappropriate. That was all it ever took. They didn't speak at first. Sergeant Logan Price, clean-cut and camera-ready, never rolled his window down. But she saw him. The square jaw set too tightly. The polished aviators that reflected the world he'd decided was dangerous. And beside him sat Elias Carter, the kind of man who looked like he was always smirking even when his lips weren't moving. He tapped his baton against the dashboard like it was a tick or a warning. In the back, Officer Matt Riley, all nerves and rigid posture, looked like a child trying on a uniform 3 sizes too big. Helena didn't have to know them personally to understand their roles. She had taught generations of boys like Riley, and she had survived generations of men like Price and Carter. The cruiser showed up again the next day, parked across from her local cafe, pretending to monitor traffic on a street that barely saw any. They stayed just long enough for Helena to notice, long enough for Sir Valor's ears to twitch and his shoulders to stiffen, long enough to let her know that they weren't going anywhere, not until they'd made a point. And still they said nothing. That was the part that crawled under her skin, the silence. It wasn't lazy, it was weaponized. They didn't need slurs or shouts. They used presence, intimidation masquerading as patrol. Every quiet moment between them stretched thinner, tighter, sharper. Helena found herself calculating her walking routes now, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Not because she believed they would protect her, but because she knew they wouldn't. Her path bent slightly more through the populated streets, past cameras, storefronts, witnesses. She hated the thought-planning visibility like armor, but she had lived long enough to know the rules of survival, and she hadn't reached 68 by playing naive, but even her detours didn't deter them. At the dog park, they leaned against the cruiser, not interacting, just watching. Logan with his arms folded. Elias pretending to check something on his belt. Matt standing slightly behind them, eyes darting unsure. She felt them dissecting her, calculating how far they could go before someone noticed how much they could push without ever drawing a complaint. Because if she said something, if she filed a report, what would it be? They were parked. They watched me. They didn't speak. What courtroom would hear that and call it a threat? What judge would care? And that's how they did it. They made her doubt her own instincts, made her question whether she was being paranoid, whether she was imagining the tension in Valor's stance or the sudden quiet in the aisles of the grocery store when she entered. The neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Conversations with strangers ended faster. The man at the hardware store who always joked with her about nails and paint no longer smiled, and one afternoon as she passed the florist shop she heard the word aggressive muttered just loud enough to make her flinch. Not about her, not directly, but she knew what it meant. It never starts with screams, it starts with whispers. The pressure tightened daily, a noose without rope. Helena found herself waking in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced she heard footsteps on her porch. Valor always stirred with her ears up, nose in the air. She had stopped opening the curtains in the evening. She had started locking her gate. She never used to. Not in this town, not in this neighborhood. But something had shifted, and not just in the officers. It was in the people, too. A collective silence. A silent agreement to let the watching continue, to let it happen as long as it didn't happen to them. One morning as she tied her scarf before heading out, Helena stared at herself in the mirror. There were lines now where youth once rested. Her hair, once a cascade of black, now carried streaks of silver that caught the light with defiance. Her hand brushed the tags around her neck. Naomi's presence in metal form, her final promise to protect. Helena whispered the words she hadn't said out loud since the funeral, "I'm still here." She stepped out the front door, Valor at her side. The cruiser was already there, parked diagonally this time, obvious, unapologetic. Logan's head turned slightly as she passed. Their eyes met. His expression didn't change, neither did hers. This wasn't policing, this was surveillance with a badge, and Helena knew exactly what it was meant to do, provoke her, trap her, go just far enough that when she finally snapped, when she finally spoke up, they could paint her as emotional, unstable, overreacting. The angry black woman, the dangerous old lady with the dog. But they didn't understand who they were watching. Helena Whitmore had been through worse. She had survived policy meetings where her name was never spoken. She had mentored students who were told their success was exceptional. She had buried her wife with grace while lawmakers debated whether they were even family. These men thought they were applying pressure, but Helena had been living under pressure for 68 years. She didn't fear their silence. She was preparing for the day it broke. The sun had just begun to slide beneath the ocean's lip when Helena Whitmore chose the quieter route, the one that curved behind the old mission, where gravel paths cut between twisted oaks and forgotten stone walls. It was where Naomi once walked with her on Sunday mornings back when the world still felt full of small mercies and wide skies. But tonight the trees whispered differently. The wind, once familiar, now felt like a messenger delivering bad news in slow, deliberate gusts. And when Valor froze mid-step, his shoulders locking like a spring, Helena knew something wasn't right. She turned her head slowly, not wanting to make it obvious. Her eyes caught the glint of a windshield just beyond the slope, a patrol cruiser lights-off engine purring like a predator's breath. It wasn't parked. It was moving. Slowly, intentionally. Creeping like it had all the time in the world. Like it had done this before. Sergeant Logan Price was behind the wheel. She didn't need to see his face to know. The car's rhythm matched his calculated arrogance. Officer Elias Carter sat in the passenger seat, tapping a baton against his thigh like a child waiting for permission. In the back, Officer Matt Riley leaned forward, his face pale, wide-eyed like someone realizing too late that the game he'd signed up for was far more real than he was ready for. Helena's pulse quickened. Not from fear, from preparation. Her hand found the tags at her throat, and for the briefest second she imagined Naomi standing beside her saying, "This is not your fault, but it will become your fight." The cruiser came to a stop just 10 feet behind her. The silence was deafening, no commands, no protocol. Just the sound of tires settling into gravel and the faint whine of the engine cooling. Then Logan stepped out, buttoned, polished, and grinning like a man who thought the ground beneath him owed him something. Elias followed, baton still in hand. Matt stayed in the back seat, lips pressed into a line, eyes glued to the windshield. Evening Professor Whitmore Logan called, voice dripping with forced civility. "Beautiful night, huh?" Valor growled a low, simmering sound that curled up from deep inside his chest. Helena didn't respond to Logan. She didn't acknowledge the mockery in his tone or the calculated friendliness of a man who had stopped pretending to be impartial weeks ago. She turned her body ever so slightly, placing Valor between them. Not as a threat, as a wall. Logan took a step forward. "Relax. We're just out making sure everyone feels safe around here." "Are you?" Helena asked, voice steady but sharp. "Because I don't." Elias chuckled, circling her slowly like a vulture taking his time. "Bit defensive, don't you think?" he said. "Big dog like that late walks empty paths. Just looks odd to folks." "He's on a leash," Helena replied, her voice clipped. "As required by law." Logan's face twitched. Perception matters, especially these days. Valor's growl deepened. "Back," she whispered to him. The dog didn't move, but he lowered slightly, locked into protective stance, every muscle humming like a live wire. Elias took a step closer, eyes on the dog tags around her neck. "What's he trained for?" Logan asked. "To protect," Helena said, "and to recognize danger." That did it. The air snapped. Elias lunged, not a full grab, but a reach just enough to cross a line to test her reaction, to see if he could draw out the anger they were counting on. He reached for the tags like they were his to touch. Helena didn't flinch. She had seen this tactic before Invade the Space provoked the response twist the narrative, but they didn't know what she had prepared for. "Guard it," she said softly. In a flash, Valor moved a storm in canine form. He didn't leap, didn't bite. He placed himself squarely between Helena and Elias, growling with such force it seemed to shake the air around them. His body was a shield, a warning. Elias stepped back, startled eyes wide. Logan's hand moved to his holster. "Call him off." He said, the fake charm gone now. Now. "He hasn't touched you," Helena replied calmly. "Neither have I." "This won't end well for you," Logan snapped. "You're right," she said. "It won't. For you." Somewhere above them, unnoticed by the officers, a drone buzzed faintly in the air. Its tiny blinking light hovered in the darkening sky, quietly recording every step, every snarl, every word. A teenage boy named Miles Carter had been filming the mission grounds for a school project. He wasn't looking for a story, but the story had found him. Back below, Elias tried to recover. "You really think that dog's going to save you?" No, Helena said. "I don't need saving." Logan stepped forward. "We can say you sicked him on us, that he snapped, that you felt threatened." She stared directly at him. "Do your body cams work tonight?" Neither officer answered. Helena didn't blink. "Because I have something you don't." Logan raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Witnesses," she said simply. Elias looked up, finally heard the faint hum in the air. His eyes found the drone. Shit. Logan turned, saw it, and for a moment, just a flicker, there was fear in his face. Not of the dog, not of Helena, of exposure. Helena stepped forward, commanding Valor to heel. The dog fell in beside her, calm again, but still watching, always watching. She walked past them without another word. Her gait was not hurried. It was deliberate, like she knew history was behind her and truth had just caught up. Matt Riley stepped out of the cruiser as she passed. He didn't say a word, but his face had changed. Something had cracked. Something had been seen that couldn't be unseen. And Helena tags warm against her chest. Breath, steady Valor at her side. Felt it in her bones. The shadow had taken shape. And now it had a name. 3 blocks away from the gravel path where Helena Whitmore stood her ground, a teenage boy named Miles Carter leaned against the rusted railing of his bedroom balcony, eyes locked onto the small drone controller in his hands. The sky above Santa Clara had begun its descent into darkness, dusky purples melting into shadowed blue. The kind of sky that always felt like a curtain falling before a play nobody was ready to end. Miles wasn't searching for anything special that night. He was just testing the new gimbal stabilizer on his DJI drone birthday gift, from a mother who couldn't afford it but knew he dreamed of being a filmmaker. He was aiming for scenic coastline birds in formation, a time-lapse of dusk swallowing the town. Instead, he captured a confrontation that would shake the entire city. Through the drone's lens, Miles first spotted the patrol car, familiar black and white paint with the town seal creeping behind a lone figure on the mission trail. He squinted. The woman was tall, older, walking with purpose, flanked by a large, alert dog. Miles recognized her. Everyone did. That was Professor Whitmore, the one who used to guest speak at the high school, the one who always looked like she knew the weight of every room before she entered it. The cruiser stopped. 2 officers emerged. One adjusted his belt like he was preparing for war. The other spun something in his hand. A baton. Miles frowned. He instinctively adjusted the drone altitude, pulling the lens in closer. And what he saw made his stomach twist. They were circling her. Not questioning, not patrolling, not helping, circling, like wolves, sniffing the air around a lioness they didn't believe could still roar. Even through the muffled feed, the body language was undeniable. Power masquerading as procedure. Threat pretending to be protocol. One officer stepped toward her. The dog shifted. The woman didn't move. Miles gripped the controller tighter. His instinct screamed to call someone. But who would they believe, a teenager with a drone? Would they believe what they didn't want to see? The woman spoke, he couldn't hear it, but he saw the command in her lips. The dog bristled, guarding her like a wall of flesh and loyalty. Another step from the officer, a reach toward the tags around her neck. The dog growled firm and controlled a snarl of purpose. Miles's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't just watching a woman being harassed. He was witnessing history repeating in real time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't bloody. But it was deadly in its intent. The kind of confrontation that ends with a press conference full of passive voice and no accountability. An altercation occurred. The suspect became agitated. The situation escalated. Except this time it didn't. This time the woman held the line. Not with fists. Not with panic. With presence. And this time someone was watching. Miles zoomed the drone in closer hands, steady. He wasn't breathing. He barely blinked. The scene was hypnotic in its horror, not just because of what was happening, but because of how practiced it was. The officers were choreographed in their intimidation. They didn't need slurs. They didn't need slams or cuffs. They moved like they'd done this before, like they had done it often. Only now there was a lens they didn't know about. He watched as the woman walked away, dog beside her, body upright like a column of iron. The officers didn't follow. They didn't need to. They had made their message clear. But Miles had caught more than a message. He had caught a truth the town had refused to name. Later that night he uploaded the raw footage. No edits, no commentary. Just the unblinking eye of a mechanical witness staring at a reality too many tried to dismiss. The video caught everything. The cruiser trailing in silence, the slow encirclement the officers reached the moment the dog stepped forward, not to attack, but to say no more. It was theater without music, drama without dialogue. And it needed no narration. Because the truth, when seen, clearly speaks for itself. When the video began circulating online, reactions were immediate and polarizing. Some praised Helena's courage. Others dissected the footage to find fault in her posture, her dog, her refusal to be small. But beneath all the noise, one thing became indisputable. This was never about a walk. It was about a system that expected silence and had found a woman who refused to provide it. Helena didn't know yet what had been captured. She didn't know a 16-year-old boy had become the unintentional guardian of her truth. She didn't know her defiance had traveled farther than the oaks and cliffs that witnessed it. But she felt it later that night, as she stood in her kitchen, hands trembling slightly while Valor lay quietly at her feet. Something had changed. The air wasn't just heavy with threat anymore. It was electric with exposure. And exposure was something power never expected from the powerless. Upstairs, Miles rewatched the footage for the fourth time, heart pounding. For the first time in his life, he understood what his grandmother meant when she said, "Sometimes the revolution starts with someone just refusing to look away." Because he didn't look away. And neither would the world now. By sunrise, Helena Whitmore's name wasn't just whispered over fences and brunch tables, it was everywhere. The drone footage uploaded by Miles Carter had ignited like gasoline on dry brush. What began as a quiet walk behind the Mission Trail was now the fire that cracked Santa Clara's polished image in half. There were no voiceovers, no spin, just unfiltered truth. A black woman, a war dog, and 3 uniformed officers surrounding her like a suspect, like prey, like a problem. They wanted to erase with silence. The angles didn't lie. The posture didn't lie. The slow, calculated intimidation was captured in full, and this time it couldn't be denied. By noon, the footage had been shared over 40,000 times. National commentators began to chime in. Local media arrived on the scene like vultures to a secret no longer buried. And in a town that had always prided itself on being quietly tolerant, the silence exploded into a violent kind of discomfort. Some neighbors crossed the street just to avoid making eye contact. Others left passive-aggressive comments on community threads. There must be more to the story. She probably provoked them. Why walk alone with a dog that big questions designed not to understand but to dilute? Dilute the truth. Dilute the responsibility. Dilute the racism woven so tightly into the fabric of their everyday comfort that exposure felt like betrayal. Helena didn't watch the video. She didn't need to. She lived it. But she felt it in every corner of her routine. At the co-op market, Mr. Halverson, who once greeted her with a hug, now handed her receipt without a word, eyes cast down. "You shouldn't have talked back to them," he muttered under his breath, his voice almost apologetic, as if she had set a fire instead of simply refusing to cower. Helena stared at him steady. "So, I should have let them corner me." "They didn't touch you," he said. "Sometimes things look worse than they are." "No," she replied, her voice sharp and controlled. "Sometimes things are exactly what they look like. You just don't want to call them by their name." That night, someone spray-painted the word "liar" across her mailbox in dripping red paint. The next morning, a bouquet of white lilies no card was left at her door. The town was dividing around her like tectonic plates. Some blamed her for speaking. Others thanked her for not staying silent. But no one stayed neutral. Even Valor seemed to sense the shift. He walked closer now, alert in every muscle, sleeping lightly, listening hard. The tension in Helena's chest had become chronic. The ache wasn't just physical, it was the ache of being seen too late. The ache of knowing people who had once laughed at her dinner table were now asking if she had blown things out of proportion. The most devastating pain wasn't the harassment. It wasn't the footage. It wasn't even the threat of what might come next. It was the distance. The way the community had pulled back like a tide, ashamed of its shoreline. The way their silence had suddenly become louder than words. This was the betrayal she hadn't expected. Not from the officers. From the people who knew her and still chose the comfort of denial over the discomfort of truth. At the weekly veterans brunch, something Naomi had helped build for over a decade, the air was so tense you could slice it with a spoon. Conversations halted when she entered. People looked at their plates or checked their phones. Only Susan Ramirez, a retired Marine, offered a nod and poured her orange juice without fanfare. The seat beside Helena stayed empty the entire morning. That evening her phone rang. It was Deputy Ava Chandler. Her voice was calm, clipped, but carried the weight of someone who had already argued behind closed doors. "We're opening an internal investigation. Ada Layla Carson will be reaching out." Based on the footage, Helena asked. "Not just the footage," Ava said. "We've seen a pattern. They've been stopping black residents across 3 districts without documentation, without cause. But your case, your video, is the crack in the dam." Helena sat down slowly. Valor lay at her feet, resting his chin on her toes, unmoving but protective. What does that mean for me? She asked. It means, Ava said after a pause, things will get louder before they get better. Louder. As if they hadn't already pierced the skin. That night she dreamed of Naomi standing on the mission trail, dog tags in her hand. Wind in her hair, saying nothing. Just watching. A dream so vivid Helena woke up reaching for her hand. She didn't find it. But she found resolve instead. The next day she walked the same trail again. Not because she wanted to, not because she felt safe, but because if she didn't, the people who wanted her erased would win, and she had already lost too much to give them that. Santa Clara had cracked, the masks were off, the faces were bare, and Helena Whitmore would not be the one to look away first. The call came just after 9:00 p.m., when the wind had begun to rattle the shutters and Helena Whitmore had finally let herself breathe, if only for a moment. She sat on her porch with Valor curled at her feet, her hand resting gently on his back, grounding herself in the steady rise and fall of his breath. The phone's ring shattered the stillness, and with it a part of Helena tensed that hadn't relaxed since the night in the mission trail. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally she would have ignored it. But something told her to answer. Professor Whitmore, a woman's voice asked, crisp but waited. Yes, this is Deputy Ava Chandler. I know this isn't a call you were expecting. Helena didn't speak right away. She recognized the name, a black woman in uniform, rare in Santa Clara, even rarer in the sheriff's department. Ava's name had floated through community circles for years, quiet, competent, and visible in the ways black women in law enforcement were often forced to be. I'm calling unofficially, Ava continued. Off the record, not for the department. For me. Her voice dropped low and direct. I saw the footage. All of it. I've watched it a dozen times, and I want you to know what they did wasn't just wrong. It was calculated. Helena stood up slowly, Valor's ears twitching as she stepped back into the house. She locked the door out of instinct. The kitchen light cast a soft glow, but nothing about the moment felt warm. You don't need to tell me that, she said, her voice flat. I lived it. I know, Ava said. And I'm sorry. Not because that makes it better, but because someone in this department should have said it a long time ago. A long silence followed. Ava didn't fill it with apology. She didn't try to patch the crack with practiced empathy. She waited. Finally, Helena asked why now. Ava exhaled. Because your walk gave the rest of us no more room to pretend. I've been tracking complaints for months, quiet ones, off the record. Black residents pulled over without cause. Harassment reports that disappeared in internal review, but no proof, no traction, nothing that stuck. And now I've become the one who stuck, Helena replied bitterly. You've become the match, Ava said. And it wasn't fair. You weren't trying to burn anything down. You were just trying to breathe, but now the whole damn town is on fire. Helena leaned against the counter, staring at her reflection in the microwave door. She looked tired, older. Not weak, but worn. Worn from years of being the calm one, the measured one, the one who smoothed the edges of her anger so white people wouldn't mistake it for threat. They want me to be angry, Helena said quietly. They want to say I provoked it. They want you to apologize for your presence, Ava replied, her voice tightening, because presence is power, and you weren't supposed to have any. Helena felt something deep inside her shift, not because Ava had given her strength, but because she had reflected it back. It was the rarest kind of allyship, not rescue, not pity, recognition. Is this another one of those calls where someone tells me I should keep my head down for my safety? Helena asked dryly. No, Ava said firm. This is the call where I tell you the district attorney's office is opening an official investigation. Ada Layla Carson has agreed to lead it herself, but she won't do it unless you agree to testify. That's why I'm calling not as a deputy, but as a black woman who's tired of watching other black women stand alone. Helena felt the words land with a force she wasn't ready for. Testify. Go public. Pull back the curtain and let them question not just her actions, but her humanity. She could already hear the media spin, dog lover or troublemaker, retired professor or radical activist. Did she exaggerate? Did she provoke? What does that mean for me? She asked. It means you'll be under a microscope, Ava said bluntly. They'll question your memory, your judgment, your tone. They'll drag your credibility through every gutter they can find. Helena nodded slowly. That's nothing new. I know, Ava said. But this time they won't be the only ones watching. The line went quiet again. Outside the wind picked up. Leaves scattered across the porch. And for a moment Helena felt Naomi's voice echo inside her the same way it had the night she decided to keep walking. Whatever happens, do it standing. She looked down at Valor. His eyes met hers, calm waiting. Ready? I'll do it, Helena said. Tell Layla Carson I'll testify. You just change the narrative, Ava said softly, and I'll be beside you every step. When the call ended, Helena didn't cry. She didn't smile. She sat back down on the porch, wrapped her arms around herself, and let the chill sink in. Not because she was afraid, but because she was no longer alone. For the first time in weeks, the air around her didn't feel like a noose. It felt like a fuse, and Helena Whitmore had just chosen to light it. The night before she was set to testify, Helena Whitmore stood barefoot in her kitchen, the cold tile pressing into her heels as the kettle screamed behind her. But the tea had long since gone forgotten. Her eyes were fixed on the shattered window above her sink. Glass sparkled across the floor like ice, beautiful if you didn't know the violence behind it. Someone had thrown a rock, not just any rock. A jagged piece of broken concrete wrapped in a strip of newspaper that simply read, "Keep your mouth shut." No name, no signature. Just fear delivered like a package left on a doorstep. Helena didn't flinch. She had swept up worse things in her life, but still her hands trembled. She turned the kettle off. The silence that followed was unnerving. Outside, Valor growled low, pacing near the back door, sensing something not quite right. The dog hadn't left her side since the footage went viral. He slept light, now, waking to every sound, every car, every shifting shadow. Helena knew the weight he carried. Naomi had trained him not just to guard, but to sense grief, danger fear. Tonight he felt all three pouring off her like static. She stooped carefully, brushing the last shards of glass into a dustpan, her movements deliberate, steady, as if dignity alone could protect her. When she stood, her knees popped audibly, a reminder of age and fatigue that had nothing to do with her body. She walked to the living room and sat in Naomi's old armchair, the one with the sunken cushion and worn leather arms. The chair where she used to read legal briefs while Helena graded papers. The chair she died in, cradled by Helena's hands. On the coffee table sat a manila envelope thick with printouts, screenshots of the drone footage, character statements, police complaints, timelines, text messages from Deputy Ava Chandler. The weight of a system that had never seen her now depended on her to speak truth into it. Helena ran her fingers over Naomi's tags at her collarbone and stared at the clock. 42 p.m. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She'd written 3 different versions of what she might say on the stand, then burned them all. None of them felt like enough. The messages had been arriving all week, some supportive, others venomous. A woman she hadn't seen in years had posted online, she made it about race. It didn't have to be. Helena had wanted to respond. It was always about race. You just didn't want to name it. Earlier that morning she had found her mailbox bent caved in like someone had struck it with a bat. Spray painted this time in black liar. But by the time she returned from filing a report, a young boy had taped a hand-drawn sign to the front gate, in crayon, "You're not a liar, you're a lion." And that was the thing about injustice. It didn't just provoke fear, it pulled truth to the surface, forced people to pick sides. It revealed who had been silently complicit and who had been waiting desperately for someone else to stand first. Helena looked around the room. Familiar, but changed. The photographs on the mantel, once just memories, now looked like exhibits in a trial she never agreed to participate in. Her wedding photo. The certificate from the university. The framed cover of her first academic publication. All now potential evidence the defense could twist proof. She was proud, outspoken, opinionated. As if those were crimes. A soft knock at the door startled her. She rose, opened it cautiously. There was no one there. Only a single sunflower taped gently to the wood, swaying in the night breeze. No note. Just color and light in a dark moment. Helena closed the door and turned off every light in the house except one. She stood at the mirror in the hallway, studying herself. The deep lines around her mouth. The gray streaking her temples. The scar on her wrist from the surgery 5 years ago. The burn mark from the cast-iron skillet Naomi dropped their last Christmas together. She was not fragile. She was forged. She picked up the blazer she had chosen for court, navy, simple tailored. She would wear Naomi's dog tags over it outside her blouse, where the jury could see them. Let them ask. Let them wonder. Let them see who she carried with her. She sat back down in the armchair and opened her phone. There was a voicemail from Ava. Helena, the courthouse has added security detail for tomorrow. You won't be alone. Layla's ready. I'll be there. And if it gets hard, just know we're standing because you did. Helena closed her eyes, breathing in the silence. She had not asked to become a symbol. She had asked for peace, for space to walk without a shadow behind her. But now she knew sometimes the choice isn't whether you stand, but what you stand for. And tomorrow, she would walk into that courtroom not as a victim, but as a woman who refused to disappear. Outside, Valor lay at the threshold, unmoving. The guardian, the witness, the final echo of a love that still protected her. And in the stillness of that shattered night, Helena Whitmore chose not to be broken. She chose to rise. The courthouse stood like a cold monument to neutrality, its polished stone walls, and echoing marble floors designed to silence, to suppress, to shrink those who entered it without armor. Helena Whitmore sat at the front spine, straight eyes forward, her hands clasped in her lap with a tension so precise it felt carved into her bones. She wore her navy blazer, and over it, deliberately visible, lay Naomi's dog tags resting against her chest, like a war medal earned long before this battle ever began. Around her, the air felt thick, not just with scrutiny, but expectation. Reporters lined the back row. Onlookers whispered behind raised phones. Half the jury leaned forward with curiosity. The other half leaned back with suspicion. Helena had been in classrooms her entire life, but this wasn't learning. This was judgment. Valor by court order wasn't allowed inside, but Helena could feel him outside those walls, waiting at the door with the same loyal stillness that had held her together for weeks. Without him beside her, she felt the absence like a wound, but she didn't flinch. She had walked here through storms worse than this. She had walked here through fear disguised as law, and she had walked here alone before she would not be moved now. The trial opened with the kind of language that tried to confuse concern with control. The defense painted the officers Logan Price, Elias Carter, and Matt Riley as men committed to safety, performing their duties in good faith, concerned about an unpredictable animal. The courtroom listened as the defense used words like miscommunication, tense atmosphere, mutual misunderstanding. Logan sat at the defense table with his usual polished grin, still wearing the confidence of a man who'd never been held accountable. Elias looked bored, arms crossed. Matt Riley, his hands fidgeted, his foot tapping uncontrollably. He didn't meet Helena's eyes once. And then the drone footage played. The courtroom fell into a vacuum of silence. There was no narration, no music, just grainy raw footage of a cruiser stalking a woman along an empty trail, the slow rolling stop, the officer stepping out, the encirclement, the attempt to reach for her necklace, and the dog's perfectly timed protection. The footage didn't shout, but it didn't need to. It revealed a truth so deliberate, so painfully familiar, that Helena saw some in the jury shift in their seats. She saw one woman cover her mouth. Another folded her arms in defense not of Helena, but of her own denial unraveling. When they called her name, Helena stood with a stillness that was not fear, but calculated resolve. She walked to the stand like every step was a line being drawn. Sworn in, she met the jury with calm, steady eyes, not pleading, not challenging, just present, fully, undeniably present. Ada Layla Carson began gently. Her questions were clear, direct, factual. Helena answered them, the same way, not dramatic, not softened, just true. She described the days leading up to the incident, the repeated appearances of the cruiser, the silence that grew heavier, the message that was sent without words. She described the encounter in the mission trail, not with exaggeration, but with precision. She told them about Valor, about Naomi, about why those tags hung outside her shirt that day. And then Layla asked, "What did you feel in that moment when the officer reached for you?" Helena paused. The room leaned in. "I felt like I was being erased," she said. "And I'd spent too many years building a life, building a voice, to let someone write me out like that." The defense attorney stood, then pacing slowly, trying to reclaim the space. He questioned her memory, suggested she had antagonized the officers by refusing to answer questions, implied that walking alone with a war-trained dog was provocative. He smirked when he said the word, but Helena didn't blink. "If telling the truth feels provocative to you," she said calmly, "you might want to ask yourself why." He tried again, poking holes. "Isn't it true you wore those dog tags to make a statement?" Helena nodded. "Yes. To remind myself who I am. Because this world keeps trying to make me forget." By the time she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom no longer looked the same. The jury no longer looked the same. And most importantly, Helena no longer felt the same. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. But for the first time in weeks, she felt visible, not in the way the officers had made her feel, but in a way that was real. Human. Seen. Heard. And in that moment, in the heart of a courtroom built to strip people like her of power, Helena Whitmore took it back. Not with volume, not with rage, but with truth sharpened into clarity. The fight wasn't over, but now the silence had a name, and it had finally been broken. The air in the courtroom felt different, too, still too tight, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Helena Whitmore sat stone still in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale, her late wife Naomi's dog tags resting against her navy blazer like armor. Behind her sat a fractured town, some who believed her, others who condemned her for daring to speak, and many who simply didn't want to choose. Cameras buzzed softly at the back, catching every twitch of expression, but Helena's face didn't flinch. She had already been judged long before this room ever convened, by neighbors, by strangers, by a system that had never expected her to survive, let alone fight back. And now she waited not for justice, but for truth to finally be named. The jury had deliberated for hours, every minute a needle, every second a return to that night, the gravel beneath her shoes, the predatory hum of the cruiser, the voice in her ear that said, "Don't look afraid," even when her heart was trying to escape her chest. That footage, grainy, raw, undeniable, had played over and over in her mind, and yet she still feared it wouldn't be enough. Because in America, truth was rarely what determined the verdict. It was what made people comfortable. The bailiff entered. All rise. Helena stood slowly, her body strong but not untouched. She carried the exhaustion of 1,000 moments of restraint, of every time she hadn't said something when they wanted her gone. This verdict wasn't just about 3 officers. It was about every unseen moment of silence she had endured, every insult brushed off, every stare ignored, every unspoken warning she had swallowed like medicine. The jury filed in their faces unreadable. The foreperson stood, a folded slip of paper trembling faintly in her hand. The judge nodded. In the matter of the people versus Sergeant Logan Price, Officer Elias Carter, and Officer Matthew Riley. The pause stretched so long it felt like a century. Helena held her breath. Her palms were damp, her knees slightly bent, ready for collapse or relief. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." Gasps echoed. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." And yet the loudest sound in Helena's chest was the sudden rush of air. She hadn't realized she'd stopped breathing. Her shoulders didn't slump. She didn't cry. She just stood taller, straighter, as if the weight pressing on her for decades had shifted slightly off her spine. Logan Price didn't move. His polished confidence cracked only in the slight twitch of his jaw. Elias Carter leaned back like he couldn't believe the jury hadn't bought the lie. And Matt Riley looked like a boy who had finally glimpsed the damage done by pretending not to see. Helena didn't look at them. She looked inward to the memory of Naomi, to the whisper that still echoed when her courage flickered, "Don't let them walk you backward." She thought of every time she had made herself smaller in grocery aisles and meetings on sidewalks, and of the night she hadn't. The night she'd said no without raising her voice. The night she let a dog trained in loyalty do what the law refused to do, draw a line that could not be crossed. The judge banged the gavel. Trotito. Order in the court. But order had already been restored, not the kind written into statutes or carved into courtroom walls, but the kind that lives in the act of resistance, in the refusal to disappear. Outside, Valor waited by the courthouse steps. When Helena exited into the sunlight, he rose and pressed into her side as if he knew, as if he had always known. A crowd had gathered, some applauding, others too stunned to speak. A young girl reached out with a yellow flower and whispered, "You were brave." Helena took the flower, but her eyes never left the horizon. Because she knew this wasn't the end. Justice had spoken, but the world still hadn't learned to listen. And so she walked forward, not victorious, not celebrated, but grounded in something stronger than any verdict, truth unbroken. The morning after the verdict, the trail behind the old mission looked the same, but nothing was. The oaks still stretched their gnarled limbs toward the sky. The gravel still crunched underfoot. The Pacific still whispered in the distance. But now each step carried the weight of history, and each breeze seemed to say we saw what they did. Helena Whitmore walked slowly, her shoulders squared, against the world that had tried to fold her in. She wore her long gray coat open, the dog tags resting proudly over her chest, glinting in the morning sun like the scar of a wound she refused to hide. Valor walked beside her, not on a leash, but close, deliberate, as if he too understood the importance of this return. For weeks, this trail had been a hunting ground, a battleground, a test. But now it was something more, a line that had been crossed and redrawn in her name. Still, Helena knew the verdict hadn't erased the cost. Her mailbox was still dented. The stairs in town still lingered a second too long. Some neighbors still crossed the street. The only difference now was that they had to live with the truth exposed. The lie of not here had been burned away. What remained was raw and real. As she reached the bend where the cruiser had first stopped her, Helena paused, not out of fear but to remember the crackle of tires, the reach toward her chest. The moment she had commanded guard and valor had stepped forward with silent authority. She closed her eyes. Her breath trembled, and then she exhaled slowly. Not in relief, in defiance, in memory, in reclamation. Footsteps behind her. She turned slightly. A young black woman, maybe in her 20s, jogging, slowed and met her eyes. "You're Professor Whitmore, right?" Helena nodded once cautiously. The woman offered a breathless smile. "Thank you for not backing down." Helena didn't smile back, not because she wasn't moved, but because resistance isn't always triumphant. Sometimes it's just quiet survival. But she nodded, and in that small exchange, something unspoken passed between them, the understanding that dignity is never freely given, it must be insisted upon. She turned back to the trail and kept walking. The wind shifted, the trees swayed. Valor trotted ahead, pausing at the crest of the hill as if waiting for her to take her place beside him. Helena reached him, the ocean stretched out before them, wild and unbroken. She had not chosen to become a symbol, but she had chosen to keep walking. And in a world that once tried to erase her, that choice was nothing short of revolutionary. The story of Helena Whitmore reminds us that dignity is not something granted. It is something we choose to uphold, even when the world tries to strip it away. In life there will be moments when silence feels safer, when fear whispers that shrinking is survival. But true strength often lies in the quiet decision to keep standing, to keep walking, even when every step feels watched or unwanted. Especially for those in their later years, Helena's journey speaks to the power of lived wisdom, of knowing when to speak and when to let presence alone be defiance. It's a reminder that every season of life holds purpose, and that legacy is not built through comfort, but through courage. Whether we are walking through grief, injustice, or solitude, our presence can be a statement and our resilience a torch passed on. Even in stillness we teach. Even in silence we lead. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment Wanji if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. An elderly black veteran sits alone on a park bench, quiet, invisible, forgotten. When police confront him and unleash a K9, the crowd braces for tragedy. But what the dog does next stuns everyone and ignites a nationwide reckoning. This isn't just a story about survival, it's about memory, justice, and the explosive moment when truth refuses to stay silent. Before we dive into this shocking mystery, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you love thrilling, jaw-dropping stories, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun bled gold across the cracked pavement of Lincoln Green Park, its fading warmth brushing against the shoulders of an old man who sat quietly on a worn bench beneath a canopy of oaks. Dominic Reed, 72 years old, wrapped in a faded bomber jacket lined with a bronze star. No one cared to notice, stared ahead with eyes that had seen too much. He didn't move much, just breathed, as though even that was a defiance. His hands calloused from war and decades of forgotten labor rested on his knees. He wasn't here to disturb anyone. He wasn't here to beg. He was simply trying to exist. Yet in this city, in this country, a black man sitting still could still be mistaken for a threat. Children raced down the paths chasing kites and squeals of joy, but they gave him a wide berth. A mother tugged her daughter away as they passed him, whispering something beneath her breath. The little girl looked back, once her innocent gaze locking with Dominic's weary eyes for a second before she disappeared into her mother's fear. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn the same look in jungles thick with death. It was the look that came right before a gun was raised or a door slammed shut. The kind of fear that didn't ask questions, just judged. Dominic closed his eyes and let the sun wash over his face. It was the only thing that ever made him feel human these days. The sunlight didn't see color. It didn't question where he belonged. It just touched him as it did everyone else. And for a few seconds as he inhaled the scent of distant pine and warm concrete, he wasn't invisible. He was just a man with memories drifting between silence and sorrow. But peace never stayed long in places like this. Not for men like him. In the distance he heard the static buzz of a police radio. At first he didn't flinch. He'd learned to brace himself in the quiet moments, the stillness before impact. He thought he'd left that instinct behind on foreign soil, but no. In America the battlefield followed him home, and it wore badges now. He turned his head ever so slightly and saw them 3 officers walking with purpose, their steps sharp, their gazes locked on him as though they'd already written the crime in their minds. Officer Sean Whitaker, the one in front, had a face carved from tired bureaucracy. Behind him, Officer Tyler Vaughn walked like a man hunting something he already hated. And the last officer, Leonard Foster, held the leash of a hulking German shepherd taut and alert. Its ears perked as if it too had learned what kind of man to fear. Dominic exhaled slowly. So it begins. He murmured to himself more a prayer than a warning. He remained seated, hand-still body language, non-threatening. He knew the game. Knew the cost of sudden moves. Knew what it meant when you had to carry both the burden of survival and the burden of proving you deserved to survive. They stopped a few feet away. "You've been here a while," Whitaker said flatly. "I sit here every day," Dominic replied, voice quiet but unwavering. "Just watching the world move." Vaughn scoffed. "You got ID on you." It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Dominic reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a worn wallet. Inside, folded and yellowed with time, was his Marine Corps ID. The letters Vietnam Veteran glinted faintly. Whitaker hesitated. Vaughn didn't. He barely looked at it. "Could be fake," Vaughn muttered. The words hit harder than any bullet Dominic had ever faced. A lifetime of service dismissed with a shrug. "I fought for this country," Dominic said almost to himself. "Bled for people who wouldn't shake my hand. Buried friends who didn't come back." Foster stayed silent, adjusting his grip on the leash. The dog growled low. A small crowd had begun to gather, families, teenagers, elders. People who just a moment ago had passed Dominic like a ghost were now watching him with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Dominic sat straighter, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd spent a lifetime learning how to carry fear without showing it. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "Just a little quiet. Just a place to sit." But in this world that was too much for a black man to ask. And as the leash tightened and Vaughn stepped forward, voice raised, authority thick in his chest, Dominic looked around the park at the faces of strangers too timid to intervene and thought, "I gave them everything, and they still see me as nothing." In that moment his stillness wasn't passive. It was resistance. It was the stance of a soldier who refused to run. And though the world forgot him, Dominic Reed, Marine survivor Elder, was about to remind them all. The breeze that had once carried the laughter of children now turned still thick, uneasy, as though the park itself sensed what was coming. Dominic Reed felt it in his chest before he saw them, the unmistakable shift in air pressure, the low hum of a police radio, and the silence that always seemed to follow when authority decided a black man was out of place. He didn't move, not because he wasn't aware, but because he knew all too well what happened when you moved, before they said you could. His body, though weathered by time, still remembered the choreography of survival, stillness, compliance, no sudden motions, no sharp replies. From across the path 3 officers emerged, walking in that deliberate, unhurried way law enforcement does, when they've already made up their minds. Leading the pack was Officer Sean Whitaker, tall, square-jawed, with the hardened face of a man who thought fairness was the same as following the rules, even if the rules were rotten. Beside him, with a swagger that bordered on hostility, was Officer Tyler Vaughn, younger, cockier, his fingers twitching near his holster like it gave him power over everyone he passed. A few steps behind them, Officer Leonard Foster gripped the leash of his K-9 partner Shadow, a muscular German shepherd trained to bite first and be questioned later. The leash was taut already. The dog had picked up on his handler's unease. Or maybe it was something deeper, something older, something it smelled on Dominic before a word had even been spoken. Dominic didn't flinch. He kept his back straight, his hands folded over his lap. The same way he had sat through ambushes in Vietnam. The same way he had sat through 1,000 indignities since returning home from that war. He had come here for peace. But in this country, peace was not granted. It was a negotiation. And every negotiation came with suspicion when your skin was brown. Whitaker reached him first. "Evening, sir," he said with the forced politeness of a man who had already sized Dominic up and filed him under undesirable. "You've been sitting here a while?" Dominic nodded once. "Just getting some sun." Vaughn stepped in before Whitaker could reply, voice sharper, less patient. "You live around here?" Dominic turned his eyes slowly toward Vaughn. "I do. You waiting for someone?" "No." "Then why are you still here?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. People had begun to notice. A few passers-by slowed their steps. A mother pulled her toddler closer. One man pulled out his phone, holding it low but recording all the same. "I come here every day," Dominic said, his voice calm, measured. "This bench, it's where I find peace." "That," so Vaughn replied, stepping closer, his shadow falling across Dominic's feet. "Funny. Most folks don't come here to stare at trees unless they're trying to hide something." Whitaker didn't intervene. Foster said nothing, but his grip on the dog's leash tightened again. Shadow let out a low growl. "You got ID," Vaughn snapped. Dominic's jaw tensed. Here it was. The ritual, humiliation, the demand for proof of existence. Yes. "Then let's see it." Slowly, cautiously, Dominic reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not quickly, not abruptly, just carefully enough to avoid giving them a reason. He handed Vaughn his wallet. Inside was a weathered laminated Marine Corps ID, barely legible from years of folding and unfolding, but unmistakable. The words "Vietnam Veteran" glinted in the setting sun. Vaughn looked at it, then snorted. "This real it is. You could have picked this up at a pawn shop." The cruelty in Vaughn's voice was calculated, deliberate, the kind of mockery that strips away a man's worth without leaving a bruise. Dominic looked away. Not in shame, but in weariness. He'd served this country, buried friends, dodged bullets, and stitched his comrades back together with his own hands. And here he was at 72, being treated like a liar on a park bench. "I didn't come here to be believed," he said, voice cracking with quiet dignity. "I came here to breathe." Foster's dog barked once loud, jarring. The crowd jumped. A little girl let out a frightened cry. Vaughn glanced at the dog and then at Foster. "You sure this guy's clean? Maybe the dog knows something we don't." Foster hesitated. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Vaughn's eyes flared. "Yet." And just like that, the threat became tangible. The leash was pulled tighter. The air crackled. Dominic remained seated still as stone, though his chest ached with the bitter truth. In a nation he'd bled for his silence was treated as defiance and his presence as provocation. He looked Vaughn squarely in the eye. "Is peace only for some people, officer, or is it just not for people who look like me?" Vaughn didn't answer. But the smirk on his face said everything the badge tried to hide. The heat thickened. What had started as a warm afternoon now felt suffocating, like the sun itself had turned away in shame. Tension curled in the air like smoke before fire, and Dominic Reed felt the first flickers of it burn against his skin. His heartbeat stayed steady, trained but deep. Beneath the calm, the ache of being reduced to a problem again began to stir. It was the same ache he had carried home from Vietnam, tucked into the hollows of his chest, beside the names of men he had watched die and the silence he had learned to live with. But here, on this bench in this park, under the shadow of 3 officers, and a leashed beast, that ache was becoming something else, something raw, something rising. Sir Officer Tyler Vaughn barked louder now, posture rigid and ready. "I'm going to need you to stand up and move along, right now." Dominic didn't move. Not out of defiance, but out of disbelief, because even after all these years the rules had never changed. You're either invisible or you're a threat. And now, as dozens of eyes watched as whispers coiled through the park like warning bells, he felt himself shifting again into their target. No matter how still he sat, no matter the calm in his voice, they had already decided he didn't belong here. "I told you," Dominic said, quiet but firm. "I come here every day. I'm not hurting anyone." Vaughn stepped forward, sneering. "You've made people uncomfortable. That's enough for me." Uncomfortable. That word again. That fragile excuse America had always used to turn its gaze away. From the soldier in uniform, from the man on the bench, from the truth. The park had gone nearly silent now. A couple backed away, clutching their stroller. A teenage boy muttered, "Why they doing this?" as his friend started recording. The camera lens trembled, but the outrage in his breath was steady. Officer Sean Whitaker, still standing behind Vaughn, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. His face flickered with doubt, but his feet remained planted, bound by procedure, or maybe cowardice. Only Officer Leonard Foster, the K-9 handler, seemed uncertain. Shadow, the German shepherd at his side, strained at the leash, tense alert, snarling with anticipation. The leash, jerked in Foster's grip, taut as a wire on the edge of snapping. Vaughn raised his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You want to make this hard on yourself, old man. You think sitting quiet makes you innocent?" Dominic looked up at him, eyes-weary voice, brittle but composed. "I think I've earned the right to sit anywhere in this damn country." Vaughn scoffed. "You think a dusty ID and a sob story makes you untouchable?" Dominic's hands clenched, not in rage, but in restraint. Every bone in his body told him to stay calm. But something inside, something ancient and breaking, whispered that calmness had never saved him. It only delayed the punishment. "I don't want trouble," he said louder now to the crowd, to the heavens, to himself. "But trouble keeps finding me every time I try to just be." Vaughn turned to Foster. "Let the dog check him, now." Foster hesitated. "He's not resisting. I gave you an order." That was the moment the world tilted. Foster loosened his grip on the leash. The bark came first, sharp, brutal. Then came the low growl, guttural and deep, as Shadow lunged forward. Gasps ripped through the park. A child screamed. A mother dropped her phone. The dog tore across the grass in a blur of muscle and sound jaws, bared eyes locked on Dominic. Every instinct in Dominic's body screamed to run, to shield himself, to collapse. But he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He rose, slowly, deliberately. The kind of rising that came from something deeper than spine or strength. The kind that came from dignity, from memory. From knowing that if they were going to try to strip him down in front of a crowd, they'd have to do it with the whole world watching. As the dog raced toward him, Dominic's eyes softened, not in fear, but in recognition. "It's me," he whispered, barely audible. "It's me, old boy." Shadow stopped, dead in his tracks. The growl faded into a whine. The rigid stance collapsed into a wagging tail. The park fell silent, stunned, paralyzed in awe. The dog inched forward, head low, sniffing Dominic's hand. Then, without command, he nuzzled into the veteran's chest, releasing a sound that could only be described as relief, recognition, love. Dominic dropped to one knee, tears brimming but unshed. "You remember," he whispered into the dog's ear. "You still remember me." The crowd gasped. Phones raised higher. Vaughn's face drained of color. Foster stepped forward, voice cracking. "How the hell?" And then through the crowd a voice boomed, with authority cutting through the tension like thunder through silence. "That man is a hero. He saved my life in Da Nang, and you're about to make the biggest mistake of yours." The park turned. A tall, broad-shouldered black man emerged from the crowd, Nathaniel Cross, his military pins gleaming in the sun eyes locked on the officers, with a fire that could burn cities. "Get your hands off him," he growled. "This ends now." And just like that, the power shifted, not with force, not with fists, but with truth, and the unbearable weight of a nation watching. The silence that followed Shadow's unexpected embrace was thunderous, a silence so loaded, so electric, it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. A trained police K-9 had disobeyed a direct order, not out of confusion, but out of loyalty. To the black man the officers had tried to dehumanize. Dominic Reed, still kneeling, eyes glistening, pressed his forehead gently to the top of Shadow's head as the dog whimpered, like a lost soldier finally home. The park, stunned into stillness, became a theater of reckoning. Cell phones recorded, mouths hung open, and even the children who had been frightened moments ago stood transfixed, sensing that something far bigger than a dog and a man was unfolding before them. It was Officer Tyler Vaughn who broke the spell. His voice raw, brittle, trembling with the fury of a man who'd just lost control. "This doesn't make sense," he spat. "Dogs don't do that unless they're trained to." His accusation wasn't confusion. It was desperation. The idea that a black man could hold such respect, such history, such bond with a police dog shattered every ugly stereotype Vaughn had chosen to live by. It wasn't the dog's reaction that unsettled him. It was the truth that had just clawed its way out into the open. Dominic Reed was not the criminal here. He was the story they'd been too blind to ask about. Officer Sean Whitaker took a step back, guilt creeping into the corners of his jaw. He didn't speak, but his body did a slow retreat from the edge of complicity. He had watched this unfold, played along, when it was just another day and another uncooperative subject. But now, standing in the glow of this man's silent dignity and this animal's unshakable recognition, Whitaker couldn't meet Dominic's eyes. Foster, still gripping the end of the leash, knelt beside the dog, his voice barely audible. I've never seen him act like this. Not with anyone. He touched Shadow gently, as if trying to understand what his own heart wouldn't let him say aloud. Dominic stood slowly, the dog pressed to his side like a long-lost comrade. He faced Vaughn, squarely, voice low and full of a kind of pain that years of silence had only sharpened. You were ready to let that dog rip me apart. Because of the way I look. Not because of what I did. Not because of who I am. He paused, but he remembered me. And you never even asked. Vaughn's jaw flexed. You think that's enough to prove anything? Dominic stepped forward, his voice growing in weight and clarity. I don't need to prove a damn thing to you. I served this country. I bled for people who wouldn't look me in the eye. I've pulled white boys out of fire with bullets in my back and prayers in my mouth. And I've lived every day since being looked at like a threat in my own homeland. The crowd murmured shock, giving way to outrage. A woman's voice cracked through the silence. He's a veteran. You sick a dog on a veteran, another man yelled. This is what we mean when we say it's not just a few bad apples, Vaughn snapped. We were following procedure. No, you weren't. The voice that cut him off belonged to Nathaniel Cross, who had finally stepped between Dominic and the officers. The ribbons on his jacket, the gravel in his voice, the unmistakable presence of someone who had faced down death more times than any of them had faced accountability. It was enough to command even Vaughn's silence. You were following your prejudice, Nathaniel said louder now, his voice rippling through the park. You didn't see a man. You saw his skin. And when that didn't scare you enough, you brought the dog. Officer Whitaker shifted uneasily. Foster lowered his head. Vaughn, red-faced, refused to look anywhere but down. Dominic, still standing now, surrounded by a semicircle of onlookers who had transformed from bystanders to witnesses, let out a slow breath. This is the part they don't teach you about coming home from war. That sometimes the battlefield waits for you. It doesn't end. It just puts on a badge. His words hung in the air like smoke from a final shot. A mother clutched her daughter tighter. A teenager wiped his eyes. A gray-haired man whispered, I thought we were better than this. I really did. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Shadow himself, who sat still beside Dominic. His head bowed not in obedience but reverence. The crowd, the officers, the park itself, everything had changed. What began as another silent assault on a black man's right to exist had turned into a public unveiling of how deep the roots of suspicion go. And still through the noise, Dominic remained composed, not because he was unshaken, but because this wasn't new. It was just finally visible, in plain sight, time fractured. The soft rustle of leaves overhead ceased. The buzz of summer insects, the distant sounds of children's laughter, even the wind itself seemed to vanish as if the world had paused in dread. In that stillness, Officer Tyler Vaughn's voice cut through like a blade. Deploy the dog. He said it without blinking, without hesitation, without conscience. 3 words that shattered the fragile line between suspicion and sanctioned violence. Officer Leonard Foster hesitated, the leash taut in his grip, knuckles white with tension. But protocol pressure and the silence of his fellow officers cornered him. He unclipped the leash, and the dog launched. Shadow, the trained German shepherd, bolted forward like a missile loosed from restraint. Muscles rippled beneath black and tan fur jaws, parted eyes locked on one target, Dominic Reed. The park gasped in collective horror. Parents pulled their children behind them. Teenagers dropped their phones. A woman screamed. Dominic didn't move. He didn't have time to run. But more than that, he refused. His spine straightened, though the decades of wear and pain screamed against him. His feet rooted to the earth beneath him, like the trunk of an old oak that had survived every storm. And somewhere deep inside, under the years of silence, under the humiliation of being ignored, doubted, threatened, Dominic Reed remembered. He remembered the jungle, the stench of death, the sound of gunfire cracking through trees. He remembered another German shepherd, a different war, A different handler, but the same eyes. He remembered the moment when that dog had found him wounded, buried beneath mud and blood and silence, and had pulled him back from the edge of death. And he remembered the promise he'd made when he returned, "I will never run again." The dog was closing in fast, now a blur of fury and training. And then Dominic knelt. His knees brittle, with age folded slowly, but with purpose. His arms extended, palms open in surrender, or was it invitation? His eyes locked on the charging animal. And in that heartbeat, that single breath between violence and recognition, he whispered, "Shadow, it's me." Something shifted. 10 feet away, the dog faltered. Its ears twitched. The rhythm of its steps stuttered. The snarl faded into something uncertain. 5 feet. 4. 3. Then a whimper. The canine slid to a halt just inches from Dominic's outstretched hands, tail twitching, head tilted, nose twitching rapidly, confused, curious, remembering. The silence returned thick and unbelievable.